We do not put Red up on the board voluntarily.
Jay, the bodies are in the houses. Marlo Stanfield's bodies.
Then they belong to him. Now, I realize you're no longer in my squad, Mr. Major Crimes. But you're still part of CID, right? Look, I'm still a sergeant, right? And I'm giving you an order on this, Lester. Until I feel chain of command out on this, and until you hear otherwise, you will not, I repeat, not, pull down any more fucking wood!
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com.
Hello guys, welcome back to Caught on the Wire. We're now at episode 12 of season 4, the penultimate episode. That's not your own, am I correct there, Alex?
That's got his own.
That's got his own, sorry, that's not the easiest title to remember. But That's got his own makes a lot more sense about the whole ownership of the kids thing, which we'll delve into, I'm sure.
And of course, this is an episode written by George Pelecanos, so we can expect plenty of very nasty things happening to our beloved characters, as is par for the course.
Plenty of drama.
Yeah, I mean, in season 1, we had Wallace getting killed. Season 2, you've got Frank Sobotka walking to his death. Season 3, we have Omar and Brother versus Stringer. And here we have all of the kids sliding into darkness instead.
Yeah, every single kid is pushed out of their home here, aren't they, really? Some of them in less subtle ways than others, particularly Randy. But it's odd. It doesn't quite feel as Pelecanos-y as the other three you've mentioned. It's
really?
I think, for me personally, yeah, it's a very good episode, but it doesn't have the same dramatic, doesn't really plant the same dramatic memories for me.
Oh,
I think a lot of the climax of this season comes in the finale, in Final Grades, whereas I think in the previous seasons, it's all about the resolve for the final episode and the climax for the penultimate. So it feels different to the other three for me. It's not necessarily a worse episode, but it's certainly less memorable.
Okay, well,
but I'm sure we can dive into.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't immediately strike me as sort of weaker in that sense for me personally. But I see what you mean. Like, this season does build more to the climax instead of the final episode. But in terms of the Pelecanos effect, if you like, in the fact that all the bad shit seems to happen in the penultimate episode. I mean, we on top of what goes on with the kids that we'll obviously talk about in more detail, and you've said already that they all get kicked out of their home or kicked out of a home in one way or another. But we also have Sherrod being accidentally killed by Bubbles, and we have Cutty being shot by Monk. And we have,
that is true.
And also perhaps the most crucial part is that the two people who probably genuinely deserve to be hurt and killed, or deserve a bullet of their own, are shown right at the beginning of the episode only feeling the force of a paintball instead, as though openly mocking our desire for justice. So
it is true. Yeah, I mean the first time round, that opening scene must have been like incredibly heart pounding, and then it's very clear that it's kind of all for show, all for training purposes. But you're right, now that you mention it, there is an awful lot of very important shit that happens this episode. I guess the difference is that there's no really important major character that dies. Obviously Bodhi's going to do that for us this season, next episode. But certainly a lot of circumstances change, and there's some really important shifts that you've certainly mentioned here. So everything has been set up for a very good finale, and that's almost jumping ahead a whole week. But for now, shall we see what the mailbag has to offer for this episode?
And it is, like Omar's choice in firearms, it is weighty this week.
Yeah, you guys are really filling up the inbox. I think for the moment we can still get through everyone, but Okay, so firstly we heard from Sam Wiles, and Sam is a first-time emailer to the show here. So he's been listening since the end of season 3, and has since then gone on to co-host his own podcast with Tom Quee. He's a good friend to both Sam and us. If you remember back to the finale of season 1, Tom was actually co-hosting with us on that. And he feels very guilty that these aren't in relation to our second to none analysis. I'll get the questions now, though, as it will make sense later. And they're very musical questions. He says, what do you think about the multiple versions of Tom Waits' Way Down in the Hole across the 5 seasons? And what's the intended effect of each recording? And do you have a favourite? So I don't know if you quickly want to chime in about that, Alex, while we're here.
Well, I suppose, what do I think about the multiple versions? That's quite a broad question. I suppose it's quite key in giving a certain feel to the episodes, particularly obviously to the titles and the way that they change. It does seem appropriate that as the title scenes change with the themes and settings and characters, or even if they are, obviously always have their faces obscured or out of shot, it does help change the mood and the introduction to each episode, and makes perfect sense that the music goes with it. So I think it's a really nice move. I can't think of many other shows that do something like that other than having them updated over time due to, like some shows they would have had a theme that was written years ago, so they might update it. Kind of like
Definitely,
famously with, say, Doctor Who. I mean, I'm not a Doctor Who fan, but I do think that the remade theme is really cool. So, that sort of thing comes to mind. But with The Wire, it's just a bit more personalised and part of the story, and I think it's a great addition.
Oh, definitely, yeah. If you've spoken about that, in terms of having a favourite, I think my ranking would go. I think numbers 5 and 1 are my kind of joint favourites, and then it goes through 4, 2, and 3. That's for me. Just my personal preference on that front, if anyone was interested. But I'm sure what we'll do, actually, I think we'll talk more about the music and stuff when we jump into season 5, because it's going to be the last time we get a change of the theme tune. And I'm sure we can make a few comments then.
I've always been kind of fond of the original, to be honest. Season 2.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course, the very gruff original version. I mean, the Tom Waits voice doesn't necessarily appeal to me the most, really. I think it's certainly not the worst. I think the Neville Brothers season 3 is the weakest for me. It's just not the best version of that for me personally. But yeah, it's good that the show does it, and you're right, there's very few examples of shows that do it. It must be quite logistically difficult to actually arrange for 5, or at least 1 original and 4 separate covers over the course of a fairly short time. So it's nice that the show does that, and it really does help to really thematically draw everything together. Sam also quickly asks, how do you think the themes of the lyrics in said song apply to the overall themes of the show? Well, hold that thought. I'm sure we'll get to that in a couple of episodes' time when we hear the Steve Earle version at the start of season 5.
That's a dangerous question, because we could talk, at some length about that.
That's a seriously of its own episode question.
We're not going to do your job for you, Sam. You're the one with the podcast about Tom Waits. You do it.
That's true, actually. I'll have to tune in for the answer.
Yeah, which only, I guess, on this email leads me to point out that if you are a fan of Tom Waits and you want to hear 2 very knowledgeable fellows talk a lot about him and his albums in a sort of similar episode by episode format, but with albums rather than TV episodes, then check out Down in the Hole. I think you can find it on iTunes and website, kind of similarly to us, I think. Probably tomwaitspodcast.wordpress.com or something like that. I think that's right. But
all right, well, I'm sure we can confirm, yeah. No, excellent.
Check them out, though.
Please do check it out, yeah. That's exactly what Sam says next. And best of luck with season 5, he says, and much respect for all the Cutty and Bunny love on the show.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so we next heard from John Morgan, who has not got in contact with us yet until now. So just wanted to say I love the work you do and have listened since the beginning. I thought you may be interested in the Simon Obama interview I've just watched. I may be late to the party with this, but just in case you've not already watched it, that is a very good interview, of course. It's quite surprised to see it. It didn't drop too long ago, did it, actually? But it was a pretty nice discussion with a very important person. In regards to the typecasting in The Wire, whilst it's true that a lot of the actors were so convincing in their roles it basically put them out of work, it's nice to see a few of them turning up in TV and film again. Maybe enough time has passed now since the show ended, but it's criminal a lot of the cast did not do bigger and better things, as for me, this show elevated TV to the level of film and has never been beaten. Thanks again, and don't worry about the extended runtime of the episodes. I love them. So, reassuring to hear some support for the bumper-long episodes that we do. Always like beyond 2 hours now.
Yeah.
And yeah, glad to see you agree with us about the travesty of the legacy of the show and the actors in terms of only a few of them, perhaps Idris, as we mentioned, really getting anywhere from the show.
Yeah, it's terrible, really, but I don't know. It's also hard to know how much, circumstance is involved. I mean, maybe some of these actors were kind of brilliant in these roles, but couldn't take on other roles. Maybe weren't as successful in other roles, or I don't know. It does happen. Like, for example, when you get bands that release an album that is just absolutely mind-bogglingly good, and then they just never do anything even close ever again. But then again, that's a matter of opinion, I guess. So
you can be such good actors that you sort of instantly typecast yourself, and you can never be seen as anyone else. It's almost a very, very nice compliment. So it is odd. It's certainly odd.
Yeah, it's still a shame, though. Definitely.
We're next going to hear from a veteran YouTuber who has, religiously gone through our YouTubes and left some very insightful comments that we've enjoyed reading.
Please tell me that this is Kevin Moore's colourful description of Ben Carson.
Absolutely.
This is fantastic.
If anyone is, was cringing or was angry last week at our complete dismissal of Ben Carson, in fact, we did not even, bat an eyelid here, showing our ignorance in many ways. But he's, of course, running for president in the USA. And he's
running
neck and
for
neck.
the sort of Republican candidate, isn't he? See, it's weird. I was saying to you earlier how if someone had brought up Ben Carson to me kind of out of the context of The Wire, it would have clicked. But for some reason, we just didn't even think of it. It didn't even cross our minds.
Yeah, and of course thinking, because I had heard his name around in the media and thinking this is sort of 10 years old now, this season. It's surprising how long Ben Carson's name has really been around. And I guess like Trump, who's been around for plenty of years now, is jumping on this presidential bandwagon. So we're going to hear from Kevin, who says, guys, Dr. Ben Carson is an ultra-right-wing, truly psychotic and arguably mentally ill current presidential candidate and snake oil salesman, polling neck and neck with Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. He's a truly scary, truly horrible, profoundly evil monster. To give you an idea of what kind of politician this guy is, he makes Clay Davis seem like Abraham Lincoln. He compares Obamacare to either slavery or Nazism, depending on his mood. His medical notoriety results from being the first to separate conjoined twins. He used this fame to sell bogus medical supplements via infomercials. This guy is absolutely vile.
Have you considered becoming a biographer, Mr. Moore?
That was, for such a passing reference on last episode's show to Ben Carson, that's a real insight into the true character there. But that was an absolutely fantastic comment, and it had to be read out.
Yeah.
Heavily appreciated. It wasn't the last we heard, actually, of our Ben Carson negligence. Gil got back in contact, and Gil says, by the way, you let Ben Carson off the hook by not getting into his disgraceful presidential campaign. He's actually leading the Republican field in some national polls now, so theoretically he could be the next president of the US, but hopefully that's impossible. He's nuts. You should Google him. A fact-checking site checked all his statements during the campaign to date and found that 100% of them were untrue. One minor note, I found one more new day for the characters of the show, the kids being socially promoted to high school. A very bittersweet new day indeed.
So we should have spotted the Ben Carson thing. We get it. Message received.
Yeah. It makes sense that we'd have a backlash here. So we're sorry, guys, and we're now very much up to speed on the whole Ben Carson thing. So thanks very much.
Maybe this gives the impression that the people who watch The Wire tend to be people who very strongly dislike Republican candidates.
Yeah, that could be a very much possibility. I I did want to pick up one more thing that Gil mentioned, which is pretty cool. He tried to get a lot of his London colleagues, because he's living in London, to the club where Lex shot Fruit last January, since it's a great underground club. I think they called it Parallax on the show, but it's actually called Paradox. He used to go there in the 90s. It was wild. You could hear the classic Baltimore club music that Chris and Snoop talk about there. There are some crazy YouTube videos of it. Unfortunately, it's closing for some reason, so they won't get to go. But I think on Yelp or something, and I think they got together and looked at reviews on Yelp, and the main criticism was that there were no metal detectors and the security was too lax. Shame, since they would have loved it and had something to talk about for a long time. So, very cool to hear some more insider info on the locations in the show. Definitely.
Yeah, excellent stuff. It didn't even, I mean, that's not something that, we probably could have looked up or whatnot, so that's exactly, it's things like that, that's exactly why we want people to email into the show with that kind of information, because it's just, like, we wouldn't have known that otherwise.
Definitely,
so,
yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yep, so we also heard from Christoph again, who we heard from last week, who had some very interesting things to say about the Telltale game discussion that we were discussing a few weeks back. He's brought some even better insight to the Telltale discussion here about whether The Wire could really be a feasible video game. We'd love to delve in for it for you, but it was certainly an interesting read for us, but it really is a very in-depth discussion that we probably couldn't get into here. But yeah, thanks very much, Chris, and keep the comments coming, certainly. Very, very good to hear. And finally, we're not quite finally, we're going to hear from Dan Weissmere, who's got something to say about the mayor, the police commissioner. It's an interesting point about there needing to be at least one black commissioner and or mayor at any one time in Baltimore. We see it initially with Royce and the original commissioner from Season 1, and this pattern is maintained throughout until the final episode of Season 5, where we see that Valchek is made commissioner by new mayor Nerese Campbell. It's jumping ahead a bit, but is there a moment in the show that is as equally as funny as it is terrifying, seeing Valchek made commissioner? You dread to think of just how terrible his reign would be. Yep, I totally agree with you, and that's certainly the feeling that we get at the final scene of the show there. Pretty grim outlook following that.
He is a piece of work.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt about that. Valchek is a very skillful rat in the police department. And quickly also about Michael Standing Tall, you will no doubt pick this up in the next episode discussion, but one thing I don't think you mentioned was how Marlowe's observation of Michael standing tall with Randy sets up the opening of episode 12. Where we see Michael seemingly on the run from Chris and Snoop. We soon realise that this is simply training for Michael and they are not hunting him down for his loyalty to Randy, which is what I believe the show is trying to suggest. I do seem to remember not believing Michael to be in any danger when I watched this episode for the first time. Something about the way the scene unfolds just makes it seem like a training exercise straight away, perhaps with it being in the middle of the day. I'd be intrigued to know your reactions when you first saw this scene. And finally, Herc's interrogation. Great that you brought up how Lester and Bunk seemingly interrogate Herc in this episode. It's a really nice way of showing how it should be done. We've seen Herc carry out some disastrous interrogations this season with Randy and Little Kevin, so this is such a well-placed scene in context. Whether Herc actually realises he's inadvertently being schooled in how to carry out an effective interrogation is doubtful, considering what we know about his ability to learn lessons. There's that education theme again. So there we have our input from Dan. Really, really good points there, bouncing off what we were discussing last week.
And we'll pick up on the opening scene in the recap.
Definitely, yeah. And finally, Corey D. Runo, who has got in contact with us before. So he's curious of our opinion of Carcetti. If your opinion has changed between your first and second viewing of The Wire. My first playthrough of the series, I really liked him and thought he really wanted to help people. However, on closer viewing, I began to notice how truly self-centered and narcissistic he was. There are examples of this in the recent episodes. For example, he decides to not help the schools in order to keep his dreams alive of running for governor. Last episode you pointed out that he rallies the police around the idea of a new day, but he refuses to fire Burrell. And in this episode he tells Rules not to play the stats game, but in the same breath tells him that he wants the murders and the vacants to fall on the Royce administration. There are more examples in Season 5 and even a few in Season 3. So how sincere do you think Carcetti is about the issues he claims are important to him? He commonly says the phrase, fuck the politics, but how often does he actually put the city or its residents ahead of his political ambition?
Yeah, I mean, with Carcetti, it's a tricky one because his arc is demonstrating how the political institution is turning good, well-intentioned people into very much part of the system as well. like he says, about putting the city or its residents ahead of his political ambition. I guess the difficulty is that it's his political ambition that has put him in a position to actually benefit the city or its residents. But at the same time, unless he can sustain that, then he's no longer any use to all these people that he claims he wants to help. So it's difficult, I guess. You could argue that maybe he should just try and stick around as mayor for a little while, and that the whole governor thing is just, he can kind of see that comparatively easy ticket up to governor, provided that he can, do a good job as mayor. So, yeah, it's a tricky one with Carcetti. I do find him very likable because I think he's very sharp, and he's compared to most of the politicians or people involved in the politics that we see, does seem genuinely like a good guy or wants to do well. And a lot of the decisions that he makes are just forced around all these dilemmas that he ends up with. And he's trying to rally the police around because he's made a lot of these promises regarding them, and he's not able to fire Burrell because otherwise, again, it weakens his position as mayor, and without the kind of political capital, as Norman describes it, he's not actually going to be able to make those decisions. So
but I like the fact that
it's difficult.
Yeah, it's very tricky. But I like the fact that even though that's an impossible decision to make, really, you can't fire Burrell, it still does in some ways raise the question, well, what if you actually did, if you did play the rules as they were, kind of written at the start?
Exactly. That's the argument that you can make against Carcetti, is how he does become a kind of part of the system as he goes along. He's corrupted by it in that way.
And Carcetti's probably still my favourite character in the show. I think I'm certainly sympathetic to his cause. I might be a little bit biased, but I believe that particularly Michael Steintorf, as chief of staff, who we actually meet this episode, I think he is a major player in corrupting Carcetti.
Instrumental in his change.
Yeah, he's that devil on the shoulder, and he is constantly there, and he's employed, obviously, to protect Carcetti politically. And that is very much going to be his downfall in terms of what he actually can achieve as a politician in terms of changing things. And I like to think that it's not Carcetti, but more the system in which he is in, which is systemically broken. So that's certainly the way that I look at it. It's not Carcetti being selfish, it's the system, breaking those who try to do anything with it. So
true, although we have to be careful placing the responsibility on an abstract concept. The institution, the system. I mean, at the end of the day, the system is made up of individuals who make decisions. Maybe it's just our irresistibility to the hive mind that stops us from breaking free on so many occasions. But it's a really good question, I think, because Carcetti is one of those characters that is easily likable, but also has lots of reasons where he does fall and become corrupted. And it's difficult to really say where one stands on Carcetti, I find.
And he's introduced so shadily, isn't he, as well at the start of season 3, sort of playing all these bended rules with Burrell and going out and having shady encounters at the fundraising evenings once his wife has gone home and all the rest of it. So, it takes a while for his really noble causes and kind of almost genuine desire to change things to really come to a head, and you start to see them and you start to realise that this guy really is a major player in the show and someone to watch and a really fascinating character. So yeah, really, really flying the flag for Carcetti, favourite character on the show.
Right, well that's all of our mail. It pains me to say it, but it's probably a good thing too, because we are quite far in and we need to get onto that recap.
Let's do it. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to you for the recap.
Okay, so this week we are looking at a sort of variety of strands, some big, some very small. We do have a very small part which is exclusively the Stanfield organisation, which is basically our opening scene. And we take a look at the school, and we take a look at major crimes, take a look at the politics, and we take a look at the Western District. They're kind of like our big ones. We also have a little bit for Bubbles, and for Omar as well.
Okay.
None of them are colossal, though. They're all sort of... We have our big ones and our medium ones, so... Nothing quite like... Was it last week where we had one absolutely ginormous section?
Yeah, no, I think all of them will keep us... Well, they won't take us into tomorrow, anyway.
And similarly,
that's
there's a lot of crossover, as usual, so...
Yeah.
Let's jump right in and start with the start of the episode. So, with the Stanfield organisation exclusively. So Michael flees from enforcers Chris and Snoop, who are chasing him with guns drawn. He hides in an abandoned warehouse and surprises them, and he tags both of them with what turns out to be paintballs. Chris asks him to explain the rationale behind his targeting, and they are both impressed at his progress.
So, obviously, following on from that ominous Stanfield cliffhanger last episode, there was that odd scene where Marlowe asks Chris about Michael and the fact that he's standing with Randy, and Chris makes that really odd face that says, "You're a loose cannon, I don't know what you're going to do." And of course, I guess the intention is to lead that into this episode and cause some real drama. Interestingly enough, obviously, you think back to what it must be like as a first-time viewer. You'd have thought there'd be some major stress, but if I try to think back to the first time viewing, I don't remember being particularly scared here. There is something about the way this scene is set up from the very start that makes it feel like a training exercise. I don't quite know what it is, but it's not quite as dramatic as it perhaps looks like it wants to be on a rewatch.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's something about the way that they normally film the action scenes that leads us to feel like it's different in some way. I can't quite put my finger on it either, but the fact that it's during the day is a point, because we do associate Chris and Snoop's violent actions with the night. Everything is done at night with them. So I guess there's that. We are, I guess, a little tricked into thinking that this is a follow-up in some way to Chris learning of Michael's loyalty to Randy, and I think it's fantastic that such a relatively minor scene like that in a previous episode leads to this. But likewise, I don't remember thinking that this was it. I was like, oh my god, what's happening to Michael? Like, I just remember being very intrigued by the scene and willing to wait and see where it went. It didn't really catch me in the grip of horror or anything. It's interesting that these mock-ups, if you like, of in this training exercise that they're doing, that they go to that much detail. I mean, Chris and Snoop even go down like they've really been shot. They really are trying to create the feel of the task that Michael is going to have to do.
It does make you wonder if the showrunners were really trying to make it look like a genuine, shocking Chris death early on. And clearly, as we've discussed already, it doesn't seem to work. But
it's hard to tell whether it fails or really succeeds in its intentions, because there's no knowing what those intentions are.
Exactly. But oddly enough, from a rewatch standpoint, it almost seems more dramatic, because you try and put yourself in those shoes of not knowing. All of a sudden you see Chris go down in the first 30 seconds of the episode, and you're like, hang on a minute, this is very unwired, this is bizarre, this is a big twist. And then, of course, it's pretty obvious, because what's the first clue? Is it the paint rather than the blood which sprays out? Is it the sort of various clues that are around the warehouse and during the running thing? It's a pretty cool scene. It's certainly a pretty cool scene. Certainly an unusual one.
Right, so yeah, that's it. That's just our opening scene. Let's move on to the school then. A little more to go through here. So, just a quick first one. We have Colvin meeting with his friend the Deacon, and at first they talk about the Deacon's decision to give up pork. Colvin explains that the school board is afraid to try anything with the current budget concerns. The Deacon offers to put him in touch with State Delegate Odell Watkins, and so later the Deacon meets with Watkins as promised. He recognises Colvin's name from the Amsterdam issue, and then the Deacon ushers him in. And that's kind of, I guess, similarly to the scene that we just talked about, or the one preceding it, the scene with Chris discovering Michael's supposed or possible change in loyalty. similarly, we get a scene here that sets us up and takes us nowhere yet.
Yeah, it's an odd scene, isn't it? Sort of very localized discussion about this Pollock Johnny's restaurant and how the pork there is dangerous or not tasty. It's kind of fun to hear it, but very much either you know it or you don't, in joke almost, or kind of certainly a bit of a Baltimore knowledge part of the show. And yeah, it's just a discussion of changing allegiances, I guess, just to tie in with a lot of what's going on, as you mentioned.
So it's a slightly odd first scene for sure. It's quite hard, certainly on the first time watching it, sort of figuring out what Colvin and the Deacon are actually talking about.
Yeah, it stays very much.
It's almost
esoteric.
like the whole conversation is like as if it's done in, purely, I don't know. You're sort of listening in on somebody's conversation, and you're just like, no, not a clue. Yeah,
it doesn't seem to make any concessions for people who don't live near Pollock Johnny's restaurants. Certainly, it's it's interesting anyway. It's fun to hear, and of course they then move on to discussing the program, and the 50 million deficit is threatening the whole thing that Bunny is trying to get going, alongside the statewide test pressures that are being felt amongst the schools at this time of the year, and of course. Which kind of makes sense that the Deacon has ties to Odell Watkins, who we haven't seen for a while actually. So there's a nice burst of hope there when he mentions that, as we know that he's obviously quite influential on Carcetti at this point. Of course, we don't get to see any of the meeting itself. We have to wait for our finale to really see the outcomes of that. So there's not a lot of movement on Bunny's story this time round, but the snippets that we do see are interesting, a bit fresh, definitely. So good to see the Deacon back anyway.
Is the message on Colvin's phone meant to be something specific? I can't remember if there's a payoff for that, but there is a kind of a pointer to him looking at his phone, and for the life of me, I can't quite remember where that leads.
Yep, so he looks at his phone. I don't know what the text says, but it links to the scene with Namond and Carver, I think. Because Bunny obviously goes to see Namond as well. This episode, obviously, this is not the only thing he gets up to. And I think that's just a way of tying those two things together. So he's called away from the meeting to go and see Namond. Obviously, I think he probably does go with the meeting first, because Namond's not exactly dying. But it just links those two features together.
Okay.
The episode. Yeah, so I think he's texted by Carver.
So let's move on to the next section of our school strand. We have Prez visiting Randy at home with his foster mother, Miss Anna. Randy is still being kept at home as he is believed to be in danger, as word has been spreading that he was working with the police. Prez delivers Randy's schoolwork and tells Miss Anna that he hopes the problem will not continue for much longer. She confides that they are thinking of switching schools to escape further difficulties. As he leaves, Prez notices an unmarked but conspicuous police car waiting further down the block. In the morning, Prez meets with Donnelly and tries to convince her that Dukie is not ready for high school, but she tells him that she's noticed the effort he's put into helping Dukie and that he must not get too close to his students since they have to move on.
Yeah, so we have the Prez doing his duty again. And I like how we get to see an even greater glimpse of the whole Miss Anna strict parenting that's going on with the it's almost some sort of Victorian discipline going on. It's good to see, as he's told sort of how to do the washing up properly, and he responds with his very formal "yes, ma'am." Certainly in stark contrast to the other parent relationships that we've seen in this neighbourhood, and of course a way of emotionally kind of preparing us to be let down by the end of the episode. Of course, the rather tragic Molotov cocktail that we get to see. It's just incredible how separate the four domestic situations of the kids are. They're very different and always quite chilling. I thought that we never get insight into Dukie's. I mean, we get close here. We see his evicted furniture, but we don't, again, ever see what his actual, do you know what I mean, the nature of his home life is.
I guess it's because Dukie's parents are so absent to him that, in a way, it makes sense that they should be absent to us unless they tie into the story in some interesting way.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just going to be watching dope fiends be dope fiends.
Yeah, I suppose so. Obviously, knowing what we do about Dukie, that will never be easy to watch in the context of Dukie there trying to be a kid, stay innocent amongst all this. But I take your point that we kind of already have Bubbles to play that role, and that we don't necessarily need to see more mindless doping. Yeah.
And of course, Prez gets that talking to about the kids not being his. And we've been saying for a little while how this has been coming. And, you know, in the first part as well, where he's going to see Randy and delivering his schoolwork, he's a very conscientious teacher and obviously a really good guy. And it's wonderful to see this. But I feel like we are also struck by that information that Donnelly gives us as the viewer, that we have to kind of move on from these kids as well, because the tragedy of what's going on here that we're seeing, especially as it comes around in this episode, is awful. But these kids are not alone. This is not exclusive to them. This is happening to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, goodness knows how many children, and you know, millions if we're considering the whole of America, worldwide, etc. Like, there's just so much more to consider here rather than the individual tragedies, and Donnelly has been sufficiently weighed down by that, I think.
Yeah, and I love how that matches up so closely with how the show deals with tragedies. It never dwells on them. You know, it will never. A death scene will never be dwelled on longer than a normal conversational scene. It very much moves on because that's the systematic way the world works in The Wire, and that's the attention that's paid to these tragedies. That there's not really any attention paid to them. So it really matches up very well with the way the show works. And I think there's a bit of a Colvin Carver thing going on with the Donnelly conversation as well. She's sort of making this big great point to up his game as a teacher and to show him that, you know, if you help out one kid, they're all in dire need. When are you going to stop helping out kids? And you need to sort of disconnect yourself to some extent. It's a tad disheartening, but he's kind of being asked to care less rather than care more, which Carver was actually being asked the opposite of Colvin. So it does show you the difference amongst these institutions, and in some ways the school system is even more broken. Yeah,
great point. I like the fact that her advice to him is have kids.
Yeah.
Have kids of your own so that you can kind of use that parental instinct for your actual children.
If you want to satisfy that urge, then have your own kids. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? It's a bit of a direct thing to say in a sort of workplace environment, but it makes sense, yeah. And of course, it's sort of followed up by this odd, intimate discussion he has with the kids about his wife and his marriage, which we'll get to soon, I'm sure. But yeah, it's a very good moment. I did like the bit going back to the Randy homework delivery stuff. There was a very sort of chilling moment where he looks over at the car that's obviously waiting. Yeah. It's not clear whether these shadowed figures, I think deliberately shadowed, are the police or are they people wanting to take revenge on Randy. And there's this sort of sense of real terror looming over the show now. And also the lack of real understanding of the gravity of this situation on Miss Anna's part. She's certainly aware that there's a risk here, but I don't think she's really aware of the full scale of the hate that runs through the streets for Randy. It's really disconcerting how she's living in some sort of relative peace here with Randy at the moment, knowing what's about to happen.
I personally didn't think there was any ambiguity about the car when I watched it. I thought that it was kind of clearly the unmarked police car, because I think Prez is making a certain point that, in Homicide, David Simon's book, he kind of makes the point that the idea of an unmarked police car is basically an oxymoron, because most police cars are the same makes and models, and also why else would some particular type of car be sat there with two guys in the front not moving for 12 hours? It's the idea that there is no such thing as an unmarked police car by virtue of what it's doing there. It is not unmarked. It felt like his look towards that car, and there did seem to be, some distaste on his face. That was what I was reading from it.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense that it's more likely to be the unmarked cop car. Obviously, we know that Carver's had it sitting there. I think you wouldn't, obviously, not most people on the street wouldn't be doing this, but you wouldn't put it past Omar to spend all day in an unmarked car, scoping people out.
But you also wouldn't expect Omar to firebomb a child, so.
No, exactly.
Or the home of a child.
No, so that doesn't quite work out in some ways there. But it was a little bit odd to see these sort of shadowed figures over in the car.
Yeah, and it's quite. There is something intimidating about it, I think.
Yeah, it's just trying to put us at unease, I guess, is really what it wants to do, and definitely, for good reasons. Yeah. And just reminds you of all these problems the boys have. Michael and these mental adjustments of the training he's doing, of the soldier training, Namond and the pressures of the street, and obviously this family pressure. Of course, you got the looming snitch reputation with Randy, which he doesn't deserve at all. And then, of course, Dukie facing having to move schools and move house, and losing that safety net from which he can actually build up his confidence, or which he started doing. So all of these kids are suddenly facing huge change here.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to our third school section and take a look at the special class now. So with the statewide exam closing in, both the special class and the normal classes are practicing test questions. So with Prez's class, we see that it continues to be disruptive, but he's able to focus them on the material eventually. But with the special class, it's much more resistant. We have Zenobia pointing out that she does not like answering questions about getting an allowance from a father when she has neither. Namond tells the teacher that he feels cheated because his class is now the same as the other classes. And Colvin tells David Parenti that he agrees with Namond. And the two share a concern that the test material does not speak to the students at all. Mm-hmm. So just a little bit here with what's going on with the test questions and the impact that it is having on the classrooms, or the two types of classrooms in the school. This is where Prez sort of has his, as you mentioned, slightly odd discussion about intimacy.
Yeah, it's this being questioned about his marriage very directly and giving very direct answers as well.
Tickle my
maybe
nuts.
Intimacy and tickling aren't the best things to say in this situation. He was just trying to think of a non-sexual example of intimacy, and I guess tickling would come into your head pretty quickly, I guess. But
I thought a quiet conversation was a good example.
Yeah. Just some sort of comfort. And of course, doesn't mention having a family for children. To raise a family, as it were. Maybe Prez isn't at that stage, or maybe he knows that the concept of raising a family sort of in this traditionally functional way isn't going to make sense to lots of these in the classroom, very sadly. Perhaps that's why he avoids bringing up that aspect of it. But yeah, so it's an interesting scene there, certainly. And I do like the tickle my nuts moment. There's that thing that a lot of teachers say when kids can say hilarious things in classrooms, and there's that moment when the kid says something genuinely funny, like you have to use the writing on the board time when you're turned away from the class to kind of hide the laughter from the kids.
Yeah.
And obviously we see that Prez gives off a nice smirk. He has to see the funny side of it, and then of course turn around and maintain that serious facade. But I did like that little detail.
Yeah, kids come out with some funny things, that's for sure.
Definitely.
And I think that Jim Truefrost's performance in this episode is really, really good. And he has been consistently very good throughout season 4. He's not often called upon as sort of strong performances in the show. I think is not often mentioned in the lists, such as they are. But I think that he's really good in this season. I do really like Prez and the performance.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. Really, really good. He's come so far from that season 3, his big season 3 moment, of course, where he seems so emotionally disconnected from what he did. And obviously the actor's really had a chance to really show off some emotional range this season, and he's really taken centre stage. And Prez has become someone who you could never really have imagined at all, particularly at the start of season 1 when he was just that absolutely disgraceful, human being. With Kevin Johnson, I think was his victim. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, he's come a fantastic distance.
And then if we take a look at our special class, they do make a good point with Zenobia about having to ask a question about getting an allowance from their father, which is obviously perhaps a little insulting. It's a question that means nothing to them in a real sense, and we just see how futile it is to get these kids to be involved in a test that they're not going to pass. They're not even going to sit down and do it properly. It's just shown as to be a complete waste of time, and supposedly to protect the financial interests of the system and help their stats. But I can't see what positive impact this is going to have on their stats.
Oh, certainly, yeah. It's certainly a concern that seems to be felt worldwide. It's certainly a criticism that there is the system here that being taught for the test seems to become the way things work, and it's all about those results. And even though a lot of schools over here where the material is more relevant to the lives of the children, there's still this element of the real education being set aside for just a slightly more sort of robotic learning test questions. You know what I mean? It's kind of that corruption of what should be the real education. It's a problem that sort of goes across the world, really.
So, anything else you wanted to mention about this bit here?
No, I think that's all for that bit.
Okay, our final school section then. After class, Dukie confesses to Prez his own misgivings about moving up to high school. Prez tries to reassure him that he is ready and that he is welcome if he needs to come back at any time. Dukie walks home with Michael and continues to worry about going to high school, and they find that Dukie and his family have been evicted again. Michael offers Dukie a place to stay with him and his brother, and Dukie returns for his last day at Edward Tillman Middle School, where he wraps up work on a special assignment. So it's being laid on pretty thick for Dukie, having to move school. He's going to be losing Prez and kind of that safety net that he had there, and now he's coming home to his house on the street. His it ain't no thing is just really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's so
terrible.
Tragically not startled to see his furniture on the street. Like it's such a regular nuisance for him. Well, that's certainly how he reacts to it, isn't it? And rather than this complete life upside down moment like it would be for most people, it shows us how little he has left to lose in life. Like it really is so tragic.
And that the first he should hear about it is coming across the stuff out there on the roadside, not from his parents or from any other authority. He literally just comes home one day and you've been evicted.
Yeah. Oh man. Nice that Michael offers up his new crib though, which in itself is a nice passing reveal that he's moved out as well. He's left his family behind.
I was going to say that's a really good way to sort of pass on that information to the audience.
Yeah. And obviously we can make all sorts of assumptions. It's probably been fueled by both Michael's mum and Michael himself. Last week we obviously had a clue that Michael was out when Michael's mum came begging for drugs from Namond. So the show doesn't just sort of blindly tell us something, it does sort of try to show us as well in different ways, which is really nice. And we can have all sorts of considerations of why that might have happened. Yeah,
well, showing rather than telling is sort of a cornerstone of good storytelling. So, and the Wire has no issues there.
Definitely, yeah. It makes sense after what happened to Michael's stepdad. It's sort of the next logical step, really. We also see how Prez, who obviously in previous seasons, he's now reinvented himself as the teacher, but he used to be the tech geek. But he can't find his way to the hard drive. He has to get Dukie to show him how to get there, unless he's pretending so that Dukie can feel more useful. I don't know. But
well, it's either that or it's perhaps demonstrating that Prez is so used to using all the police technology, which is really out of date, that when it comes to having a brand new computer, he suddenly becomes unfamiliar with it, even though he's interested in it because he's interested in the technology. He's been sort of left behind a little while because of having to deal with all of the out-of-date police equipment. It's not like we ever see any of the police using fancy
Windows
computers and things like Windows and whatnot. I mean, the system that we saw them using with that face enhancing technology, whatever the hell it was that they had.
Yeah.
It wasn't on a standard desktop computer. It was clearly on some specialist equipment.
Although we do see a lot of the computers running Windows XP. But yeah, it is a sign of the times, perhaps. Certainly.
And a good advert for Windows.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, we do have a final scene in Prez's classroom for that final school bell, with Dukie abandoning. There's a subtle scene actually where Dukie abandons this Microsoft Publisher document, where he's doing sort of a collage about Mr. Presbo's math class, as he puts at the top. And there's sort of mug shots of the whole class. I think he managed to get about 5 of them on, but he seems to abandon it when the last school bell goes. And yeah, just a way of showing us how much this class has meant to him. Really breaks your heart a little bit, actually. And the way he really savours the last moments. He really takes a step every 10 seconds to be the last person out and scans around the classroom, watching Prez doing his teaching thing. It almost goes in slow motion, this scene, actually. So it's a scene that's perhaps filled with a bit more sentimentality than the one normally goes for. The way he sort of hangs around in this classroom to remember, but they do want to get the point across that Dukie is losing this confidence safety net that he's found, and you have to you can't argue with the fact that he's become a different person since becoming comfortable with this classroom environment here.
Yeah, and Dukie kind of takes that final look back at the computer, for example. It's almost like he's looking back at a friend leave or something like that. But you're right, he really does scan the classroom and make the most of his final moments in there, and it's a pretty heartbreaking scene, as is the case so much with Dukie, especially in this episode.
Yeah, especially in season 5. His tragedy only goes up in season 5.
Well, yeah, so far.
Yeah,
but it gets worse.
Definitely. All right, any more on the school stuff?
That's it for the school.
Okay.
So now we can take a look at major crimes, which is a slightly larger strand. And we'll start with a shorter one, as it happens. We have Lester continuing to search the area where he found the body of Lex in a vacant house. He's identified the type of nail used to seal the house as being indicative of further houses where bodies will be found. Sergeant Landsman arrives and orders Freamon to stop opening vacant houses because finding John Does at this stage in the year will destroy the homicide unit's clearance rate.
All right, so this is post-credits, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
The second opening.
It's interesting that after playing dead with Chris and Snoop in the opening, we have Freamon, after the titles, dealing with the real dead, thanks to Chris and Snoop.
Yeah, it sort of trumps the Michael scene heavily, isn't it, when you realise the gravity of what Freamon is uncovering here. And of course there's a very different take on Lex, as we see his full skeleton following complete disintegration of the body.
Yeah, it doesn't take that long.
Yeah, it's only been 4 or 5 months. I mean, it's Christmas time now. So yeah. And
then Landsman arrives and we get some vintage Landsman. You are not to pull down any more fucking wood, which I think is a really good line for some reason. I don't know why, but I like that. Yeah,
it sort of matches up with Landsman literary skills, doesn't it? It seems to work. And Landsman's, fury with what's happening here in terms of stats. It just demonstrates what one of the review board for the police said last week, that our pups were trained on stats. Despite the fact that apparently it's a new day now. And that we're doing police work, and Carcetti's been round and made that change face to face with people. There's just this ingrained need to keep the stats safe, and just changing the official mandate might not shake the stats out of them. And it would be, as the guy says, years of training would be needed to actually make a difference to these guys who are, second nature ingrained with it.
And what's more, it's the supposed new day that got Lester there. It actually put him in that position. It's a new day. Rawls is, happy to give that unit back to Daniels and let him do what he wants. And in Daniels' exuberance for the new day, he hands it over to Lester and says, take on whatever you like. As far as I'm concerned, you are the major case unit, etc., etc. He gets into this position. He finally has in his incredible investigative powers, solves this thing in one episode, and then he's immediately stopped by the stats game, which is supposedly what has is meant to have been solved. So yeah, it's a very frustrating moment for Lester, I'm sure, but it makes some great television for us.
Yeah, thankfully it's only a temporary measure. Obviously, the mayor does get involved again, and he, for the most part, is consistent with his desire to not let the stats get in the way, and those bodies now have clearance to come out as of the end of the episode. So, bittersweet, really. You also need to remove the media from the equation. I think even if the stats are not a priority, the papers will still report them, and obviously, thus anything constructive you try to build as a case will come under extreme pressure. So even if you remove the stats from it, that I think the papers will still try to make a stats game of it themselves for the public perception. So it is tricky to actually bow to those pressures, definitely.
And not only that, but if you're going to go to the media and say, "Oh, we don't want to concentrate on stats anymore," that's it's like they say in The Thick of It. Is it Terry Coverley in The Thick of It that says, if you say, don't pay attention to this, that's exactly when they start paying attention to it. And I think the analogy she uses is, if you tickle me, I'll wet myself. Yeah.
That's the thing, because obviously if they were to go to the media and say, look, stats isn't the game anymore, you could totally see the headline being spun as,
stats now so terrible that they're trying to tell the media to stop looking at them.
Exactly. Chief of police turns his back on policing. You could see it as something like that. Like it would be a
nonsense.
real... Yeah, so it would be... Yeah, you can see that despite the fact that the mandate's changed, there are other things to consider that keeps it from really working. Also, one final consideration is, were the nails an oversight on Marlowe/Chris's part? Obviously, the nails are all of a sort, and the actual doors that were nailed in by the housing department are of a different sort. And when you see how simple that difference is, it makes it seem almost silly. Not that they ever would have found necessarily the right nails to use to cover their tracks, but, just something to consider, I guess.
Well, I guess it comes down to the fact that they got to make a mistake somewhere, and it just takes the ingenuity of the homicide detective to pick them out.
Yeah.
Also, they've shown to be plenty cautious thus far. I mean, Herc barely even got a whiff of that nail gun. It didn't seem to concern him whatsoever, and yet Chris is still smart enough to throw it in the river. All right, shall we move on to the next part for Major Crimes?
Yeah.
Okay, so Freeman's mood is lifted slightly when he returns to the detail office to watch Marimo's departure. Herc is overjoyed to see the back of the lieutenant, telling the other detectives that Marimo had planned to ruin his career, but instead Marimo was the one forced out of the unit. Freeman quickly turns to the Stanfield investigation. He asks Sidner to restart surveillance of Stanfield's people and dispatches Dozeman to City Hall to look at high-value property sales and to check for luxury car purchases. He asks Herc to begin work on requisitioning back their wiretap equipment, and then tells him that he himself will be at the missing persons department to search for Stanfield murder targets. Herc pulls Freeman to one side at the end and asks if he can give the direction, as he is the sergeant. Later, Lieutenant Asher returns to the unit and asks what the brass is thinking after having transferred him out just a few months ago. Freeman doesn't answer the question and instead inquires about Asher's beach house and welcomes him back.
So as you mentioned last week, there's the inevitable and satisfying exodus scene for Marimo.
That's right, yeah. This is our bringing back the detail collection of scenes, I guess. And like you say, yeah, it starts off with Marimo leaving. It sounds like he's, just kind of being agitated in the office by himself or something.
Yeah, he really doesn't play it cool like you'd expect from what we've seen of him.
Yeah.
So there's grunting and groaning going on. Surprised that he's annoyed to be leaving. I mean, he really didn't seem to enjoy it here by any means.
I guess that was just his style, wasn't it? I suppose he wants to be considered valuable enough to go around and sort out a particular unit, and he's only got a short. In his eyes, he's only had a short period of time, and now he's out again. And
Yeah.
as we've already seen, like when Asher got moved out after only a short period of time, his first response was, "Have I done something wrong?" So this is clearly seen as a sign of perhaps someone doing something wrong, is when they get moved out very quickly.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah. And he has done something wrong in Daniels' eyes, like he has not progressed the case at all.
Yeah.
So, certainly is worthy of leaving.
But it's, it's worth pointing out, just bloody hell, Herc. Like, he narrowly escapes being done by Marimo and immediately follows up with no humility or self-awareness whatsoever.
Yeah.
And just immediately starts making demands of Lester's to make it seem like the direction is coming from him instead.
It's just ridiculous. Yeah, it's oh dear. He's never going to satisfy this Herc, is he? And also, as soon as Marimo leaves, he's very vocal about how he completely believes he's off the hook now. No longer will Marimo, who he thinks is the only one who really knows about the fishiness with his investigation. Herc's got no idea how far up the chain the strings are being pulled with what happened with the ministers. Of course, unbeknownst to him, the mayor is still in direct deliberation about his future on the force, and it won't even be until the episode's end that actually gets resolved. Again, just Herc not being able to put two and two together, not being able to think beyond that tree, not having those soft eyes that he needs to be the policeman. Yeah, and as you say, just that absolutely revolting remark he makes to Freamon with a completely serious face as well.
Yeah, doesn't seem to be any irony in that whatsoever.
Yeah.
He genuinely seems to believe that Lester Freamon, this veteran of the force and clearly one of, if not the best detective in the whole city, should sort of defer his information to Herc, as if anyone would believe that would come from him.
Yeah.
What a waste of time. If Herc were to come out with information like that, people would just be like, you didn't come up with that.
Yeah. Yeah, oh dear.
So, very, very strange. And then when we have Asher returning, I really like that he's described by Freamon as one of the most effective supervisors in our department. And what makes him so effective is because he's not. It's because he does nothing. And that's exactly what the investigators need, is to be left alone and left to get on with their investigations.
Definitely. He loves Asher, but obviously doesn't respect him at all as police. And the way you say he describes him to Herc says as much as that. And I love how he can't resist making the appropriate beach house dismissal joke, which seems to communicate the same thing to Asher in a very sort of much more subtle way that Asher doesn't really understand.
That's only got a little bit of ammunition left in it, I think.
Yeah.
I think if they push the beach house thing any further, the guy might
just gonna
start
knock it down.
Yeah, he's going to start figuring out that maybe the joke's on him.
Yeah. Oh dear. And of course, we have the scene where Freamon gets to work very quickly and delegates roles out. He's clearly been thinking about this. He's probably been dreaming about it for the past 3 days, because he knows what everyone's doing within about 10 seconds. So very promising opening speech, setting things into motion. Obviously, we don't have McNulty. We don't have Daniels, Greggs, Prez. He literally is the MCU and does have a few sort of lackeys below him to help him out with stuff. He's certainly trusting them with fairly tricky police work, a lot of paper trail that you'd only thought he'd trust Prez with, really. But I guess he's having to work with the manpower he's got at the moment. And
he's eager to get it going, because it's been stagnant for so long.
And it's really well-intentioned work. It's a bit off the mark. Obviously, both the wiretap acquisitioning and following the paper trail would have worked for the Barksdales, but with Marlowe no longer liking to indulge in either of those things, his money is his, it doesn't go any further, and of course they don't use phones, so it's just him and his money, full stop. That investigative method won't really work, and he's obviously going to have to play catch-up like they do every season with the detail for that. So
it's nice, intentional or otherwise, that Freamon has moved Sydney onto the surveillance of Stanfield's people, considering the massive balls up that Herc made of it. and the fact that Sidner seemed a little bit more, intelligent about gathering information in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, I think we mainly see Freamon, don't we? What he gets up to, going to the missing persons department, which is now down to one person, which is ridiculous when you consider that all of those files there have gone completely unexamined. You'd have thought that would be a pretty important apartment to keep well manned. So at least the records are there, and there's certainly going to be sort of a key aid in solving the case of these vacant murders, because you can kind of link them all up to these different missing persons reports, which is the only real link they have, I guess.
Yeah.
There's certainly no way they'll be able to link them to the Stanfields. So I guess my point about the nails earlier doesn't really stand up, because they've already removed any sort of evidence that they might be able to get beyond the nails.
Right, shall we move on to the next bit then?
Yep, I just wanted to mention quickly that there's the security guard, isn't there, that's mentioned as one that came up as missing, and Freamon doesn't think that Marlowe would have done the security guard, which shows even more how he has a lot of adjusting to do to understand Marlowe's motives.
That's
and the
true,
fact that he defies this traditional logic of what a crook and a gangster is, and it will make finding a motive almost impossible for the murders here, sort of thing. So, yeah.
Something even Lester Freamon can't fathom.
Yeah, it's really changed the game a lot. Okay, yeah, let's move on to the next one.
Right, well, sticking with Lester, he meets with Cedric Daniels and Rhonda Perlman. He makes a case that they should be searching other vacant houses for further bodies. Like Landsman, Daniels is concerned about the murder rate, and Perlman asks what other work they are doing on Stanfield and whether there are links between Stanfield and the missing persons that Freamon has selected. He explains that there are links in some cases and presents his strategy for following the money and resurrecting the wiretaps. He asks if Landsman has run the information about the bodies up the chain of command to Daniels, and learns that he hasn't. Perlman leaves the decision to Daniels, who tells Freamon that he will take it to the command staff. Later, Daniels meets with Rules to explain Freeman's theory, believing Freamon to be right. Daniels suggests that pulling the bodies before the end of the year makes the poor statistics attributable to Royce's administration, and so Rules orders Daniels to keep the suggestion to himself, and then meets with Carcetti, telling him about Freeman's discovery. But Rules offers Daniels' suggestion as his own, and Carcetti chastises him for thinking of stats, but still encourages him to uncover the bodies before the new year.
Yeah, so we have a little chat with Daniels here, where Freeman's estimate is spookily accurate. He reckons a couple of dozen bodies will be discovered, and I think the actual figure turns out to be 22. And I like how Daniels actually drops this to 1 dozen when he takes it upstairs to Rules, just to try and keep a lid on things and to try and keep the police work honest.
Yeah, it's also interesting that we hear how Landsman was so concerned about the impact that it would have on stats, and therefore the impact that it might have on him should the information reach any of the ears of the bosses, that he hasn't even told anyone about it.
Yeah. That's very, very true, actually, isn't it? Yeah, Landsman's still very much in the old guard here. And it's, again, very encouraging to see how Daniels is definitely on Freeman's side here, following through with his new sort of carte blanche reform of the police department. He's doing that Daniels balance thing. He's going to sit here and play devil's advocate for a bit with Freamon to try and challenge him on what he's actually discovered. Obviously, he's suggesting that there be very few good reasons to raise the city's murder rate by 10%. He's very aware of the stats game behind it, but he's actually plays a very, very clever game with Rules here. He sort of seems to cushion the blow in a few ways, but also doesn't hide the truth of it. And yeah, it's obviously a very successful way of putting it across.
I do like that there's two things, I think, going on with when Daniels goes to see Rules. Is that firstly, most obviously Rules is concerned about directives coming from Daniels. He doesn't want to make Daniels' path to, or supposed, path as the anointed one, as Valchek puts it. He's passed
Yeah.
to commissioner. He doesn't want to make that easy for him. He doesn't want to make it look like all these great ideas are coming from this up-and-coming police officer. And he wants to help spotlight his own abilities, and in this case ends up making the idea come across as his own.
Yeah,
But
he's trying to find way to gain that political capital for himself, isn't he, there?
that's right, yeah, he's kind of taking it for himself. Not a particularly smart move, but I guess he thinks that it works here. But what also struck me is that this request that Rules makes of Daniels to keep it quiet and then going to make it seem like the orders came from him, it kind of reminded me of Herc's request to Freamon, and that he wanted the directives to come from him personally, whereas here Rules tries to do a similar thing but sort of under his nose.
Yeah.
And the balance of power is the opposite.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, Herc just wanted a bit of shallow glory, didn't he? Whereas Rules obviously has a very good political reason for doing this. It's wanting to get back in Carcetti's good books, which might be tricky because he's got to change his skin colour in some ways to do that. But yeah, it's certainly a good link to make.
And we have the ranks supposedly going, Herc wanting to have the directives because he's supposedly the one in charge from Lester, supposedly the subordinate. But instead here we have Rules, the superior, taking ideas from his subordinate because he hasn't got them himself.
Yeah, that's very true, isn't it? And I love the fact that Daniel's idea uses stats as a way to not make the stats count. You know what I mean? Like, it's a really palatable way to put the murders across to someone who still ultimately thinks about things in terms of stats. And of course, that's the first topic of the conversation. It's the stats, despite the fact that, again, we are in this new day. So yeah, it's really, really clever what Daniels does here. And in some ways shocking, because the actual real tangible meaning behind the murders is not up for consideration or thought. It's nice that Carcetti later makes this point as soon as Rules brings up the whole stats thing. He continues his somewhat patchy New Day agenda in a good way. He mentions, that's disgusting that these bodies are here, bring them out. But, as Runo says in the same breath, but I don't want those stats on my plate. So, patchy New Day agenda, I think, is the word for it. Patchy New Day agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, it's we've kind of already discussed that bit, really, but yeah, Carcetti makes that move, and certainly politically it is the right move to make. It's I guess it's not just the stats, isn't it? It's everything that comes with it, like the media that we were talking about before. It just makes his job easier, which in turn makes it easier for him to carry out these sort of, certainly well-intentioned policies or ideas or reforms that he wants to make.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So for the moment, he's still, he's still in the good books. He's still following through with his plans for reform. He's bringing out the bodies now, which is the right thing to do. Even if it's a scary thing, it's hard to tell how the city's going to react and how it's going to make his perception sort of rub off on his perception for the moment. Yeah.
All right, so next up, still with Freamon, we have him discussing the problem seeing as he is the major case unit,
Yeah, that's true.
Freamon discusses the problem in a bar with Bunk and Jimmy McNulty. Bunk tries to steer the conversation away from the bodies, but Freamon will not be diverted. He bets that he can open any row house with matching nails and find a body, and Bunk accepts the wager. As McNulty goes to leave, Bunk tries to convince him to get drunk with them, but McNulty resists. And the trio don't take long to find another one of Marlowe's bodies, and McNulty suggests calling the crime lab. Freamon tells McNulty that he's not allowed to discover any bodies without the go-ahead from his superiors, and when that happens, McNulty will miss out on the investigation. As they leave, Freamon and Bunk both note the irony of McNulty being the most suitable to drive.
Yeah, so despite a season of it, McNulty's light drinking policy I don't think has ever felt to have become him, has it, or to have settled as a McNulty thing. There's always an element of it being forced, and there's just this unfortunate feeling that you can't take the McNulty out of the Jimmy, despite the fact that it has been working for a long time now. Like, he really has been very consistently throughout the longest season of the show, playing this new house, Jimmy. So yeah, it's just interesting that it never feels like him, and that's obviously because he's been established as such a mess up of a character for so long. It's only a matter of time before this really collapses, and it does next episode.
Yep, but it's good that the show takes the effort of not making it seem like a fad. Like, to some extent, it does take a bit of time to settle in, and we get used to this supposedly new McNulty, which gives it more impact when it does return to its usual state, I suppose. Even if it does feel inevitable, at least it's taken a bit of time to settle in. And, of course, we have Freamon and Bunk making the observation that it still seems a little odd to have him as the responsible one.
Yeah, and I'd forgotten actually how little Beady plays into this season. You'd have thought that they'd, to kind of back up what's going on with McNulty here, they'd need to show a lot of the stuff that goes on between him and Beady, but I think beyond that bunk dinner early on, we haven't seen her at all, have we? It's only once things start collapsing that I guess they need to bring her back in and show the frustration she's having with Jimmy as he goes back to his old ways.
Yeah, you thought you might see a little bit more of the domestic side of things in order to ground everything that McNulty is doing, and perhaps where this intention is coming from. But they don't. So yeah, that's that.
I mean, have you missed him this season? Has he?
No, because it's kind of given. Not because I don't like seeing McNulty on screen, but I think it's good that he's about as close as The Wire comes to a main character, and giving him a break. I know obviously there are sort of real world reasons that he was left out somewhat, but it's good that we kind of get a break from that and other characters get a chance to shine, and it's just like a bit of bit of fresh air and gives it an extra unique feel to the show. It demonstrates the strength in all its characters in not needing to rely on particular sets, and how there, we've talked plenty of times before how there are certain characters or ensembles of characters that we spend a lot of time with in certain seasons, and then either never again or barely at all.
Yeah,
and then they come back, and especially seeing as the role that McNulty has to play in our final season, it's probably a good thing that we don't get too engorged on his tales in this season before.
Yeah, and I love how the show proves that it was the right thing to do by the fact that the episodes where he doesn't appear, of which there are a few this season, you never notice it. You know what I mean? Everything else is so engrossing that the fact that the main character of the show isn't present never crosses your mind, really. Perhaps until we get down to discussing it. So I think there's very few shows where that would happen. Obviously, The Wire is more of an ensemble show than a lot of other character dramas. An episode without Tony Soprano, an episode without Walter White is very obvious. But it does stand testament to the show's quality and sort of expansiveness that you really don't notice it.
I like that in this scene in the bar, once again we have Bunk and Lester having very different conversations again. We sort of spoke before about how they were trying to have two conversations at once, basically, both trying to steer the other onto something else.
Yeah. It's always a thing that they're always at different levels of inebriation, and that seems to spur on various different desires in them. Bunk's normally obviously babbling and thinking with his dick in a lot of cases, and then Freeman's sort of alcohol almost spurs on his creativity as far as the casework goes. So it's always good to see those character traits coming out in the bar.
It is kind of interesting. Hard to say in my own personal experience or how often this happens, or maybe it happens very often, but it's interesting that these detectives reach a point of such drunkenness that they openly talk about these murder cases essentially in public.
Yeah, that's
even
true,
making wagers on them and whatnot. I mean, we've obviously seen before how that it's in a way part of the gallows humour that a lot of the police adopt, especially the detectives. Kind of making these bets on these horrible things. It kind of makes sense within the police environment, but although they are in a bar, they're still kind of in a public place with just ordinary citizens around them, and they're talking quite loudly about making a bet on finding bodies in row houses and all this sort of stuff. So, not afraid to have those kind of discussions in public, clearly. Perhaps the average Baltimore resident is not too shocked by the talk of bodies.
It's hard to gauge how loud the bar is. I mean, there's a chance that they really are having to shout into each other's ears here.
Well, it's TV bar and pub, isn't it? Like, whenever you see films... I can't think of many films except for... Well, a recent example just happens to be coming to the top of my head is, like, The Social Network, where the scene that they have in the club, they actually do have to shout. And it's nice that you actually can't quite tell what they're saying at some points because the music is so loud.
Because that's exactly what the bar is like, isn't it, really?
Whereas that's a kind of true representation of it, whereas in TV shows and movies, they always seem to be quite capable of having ordinary indoor level conversations with one another. It's like, what kind of bar is this? Where is it? And how do I get there?
That's definitely one of the false elements that a lot of shows fall into the trap of, definitely. And you can understand why, because, who wants to hear people shouting into each other's ears over a load of noise, really? But
do you think you could communicate that to all bars and pubs everywhere? Who the hell wants to shout at one another when you've gone out to have a drink and a conversation?
Yeah.
I wish bars were like... Maybe it's wishful thinking. I do wish it was like the TV ones, because then you could actually sit down and talk to people.
Yeah, actually have a chat like these guys apparently are doing about their murders. But but perhaps your point about the murder discussion is if we were to be there and see how loud things were, you could see why they were being so open about it, and no one's going to hear them. But yeah, it's certainly a good point. I think particularly in season 5 they talk very openly about the racial politics of murder and stuff like that. Like, this ain't Aruba bitch, I think, is one of the bunk quotes. So that seems to be in a quiet bar, if I remember. So maybe we'll have to revisit this a bit later.
All right, let's move on to our final major crimes section then. And again, with Freamon. He meets with Herc and Sidner the next morning and is dismayed to learn that none of Stanfield's people are using phones, and comments that if the wiretaps had been left running 2 months ago, they would not be facing these problems now. 2 detectives then arrive from the Internal Investigations Division. They ask Herc if he remembers borrowing the camera from ISD, and that they need a statement regarding the camera and some of his confidential informant paperwork. They request Sidner and Dozeman as well, but Herc tells the detectives that he is solely responsible. Later, Freamon receives the go-ahead from Daniels to open more vacants, along with an offer for further manpower. 2 CID officers of his choosing, in fact. Freamon first approaches Kima, but then decides not to ask her when she tells him that she loves homicide.
So, Herc is busted. Thomas Lombard Dotsie, or Dozie's acting is really good here. He sort of plays the whole nerve. He suddenly realises that his world is about to end, really. But quickly sort of resigns himself to this fact as well, which is somewhat really quite, comforting to see. It seems to be a bit of a maturity.
It's so strange to see such a foolish character do something incredibly, noble,
mature,
and thoughtful, and mature. It's a very odd moment, maybe one of the most likable moments for Herc.
Definitely, and particularly as he puts that silver lining on by completely sticking up for his guys here when they're also called in, Dozeman and Sidner, which he totally should have done because they really weren't involved. Well, they kind of were involved, but totally just went along for the ride. You could perhaps argue that they should have done more to stop him. Looking for. Yeah, absolutely.
Which, unfortunately, I think in legal terms, does put them in the shit as much as anyone else. Maybe not quite as much, but at least Herc has the good sense and decency, dare I say it, about Herc, to take full responsibility. Because although, they were part of it, this is all Herc's idea, his master plan to catch Stanfield, that ends him in an awful lot of hot water, and of course will inevitably put him out of the force altogether. Yeah,
and of course what he does here with throwing Sidner and Dozeman out of the line of fire is a bit of a Daniels trait, really, isn't it? And almost seems like one of the only lessons that Daniels managed to successfully pass down to him. Difference is, I guess, that Daniels did it when the guys really deserved to get the job, and in this case it should be the least that Herc is doing, so it's still not quite on the Daniels level of nobility. Yeah, so we see a real episode of this thing gradually working up the ladder, the sort of chain of command in action, yeah, so yeah, Herc is gone from the force now, which is a pretty damn good thing actually.
Yeah,
pretty.
the streets are safer now, I think.
Yeah.
Of course, what we end up later with is Freamon getting the go-ahead from Daniels to finally open up more of those row houses. And a sort of little added extra for him is that he gets some more manpower as well to add to his major case unit now that this is happening. And the first person that he approaches, Kima, has gone from, being the newbie to now very comfortable with homicide. She seems right at home, having some kind of casual phone conversation. We're not sure with whom, but she seems to be loving it there, and thus Freamon sort of changes his mind.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Doesn't want to take her away from something that she enjoys, I guess, which is nice of him.
Yeah, and she stays in homicide to the end of the show, I think, doesn't she? Yeah,
yep.
Definitely. So that's pretty cool. She's found her place, and yeah, that, as you say, the word comes down from on high, as we've seen it go all the way up the chain this episode. There's been no McNulty around to muddy the chain of command and take things up a few steps.
Yeah.
It goes right up to the mayor, and the mayor brings down the word. Unfortunately, he seems to pay lip service to the actual murders more than actually caring about them, but he does suggest to rules that the stats are still important to him, and of course they are. He's the mayor, perception is everything, and bring the bodies out.
Yep. And that's where we get to next episode.
Yeah, we got to wait for the real action on that front. Definitely, a lot of the good stuff is reserved for that final episode.
So anything else you want to add for Major Crimes?
No, I think that covers everything with that one.
Okay, let's move on to politics. I'm actually going to do this all in one because it's just a bit simpler that way. Right, here we go. So Carcetti holds a meeting to discuss the massive school budget deficit. Both Nerys Campbell and Andy Krawczyk refuse to take responsibility. Carcetti's new Chief of Staff, Michael Steindorf, suggests that the only solution is to scale back their budget in all other areas. Carcetti refuses to break the promises he had campaigned on, and Campbell tells him that the only alternative is to beg the Republican governor for financial support. Carcetti and Wilson find themselves waiting in the middle of a staircase for the governor. Carcetti gripes that they've been waiting for over an hour. Wilson shows Carcetti an article written by Mike Fletcher quoting the governor about the school's financial problems, saying that the blame falls on a lack of local oversight. Eventually, Carcetti decides to leave, and just as they get to the door, the security guard tells them the governor is now ready for them. Later, Carcetti meets with his staff to discuss the governor's offer, which is more money in exchange for greater state control of the city's schools. Campbell tells Carcetti that the governor is protecting himself for the 2008 state election by making Carcetti look bad for accepting the money. The budget advisor encourages Carcetti to take the money regardless. Wilson agrees. Steindorf does not. And Campbell refuses to offer an opinion, saying that she will criticise them either way.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing we see here is the introduction of Michael Steindorf, the Chief of Staff that Carcetti employs, who becomes a pretty prominent character throughout Season 5, and as I mentioned earlier in our mailbag section, seems to have a very important but sort of underplayed role of being this guy who, for me, sort of corrupts Carcetti, always playing this devil-on-the-shoulder role to the greatest extent throughout the series, and always pushing him to do that selfish thing.
He's almost like that puppet master role, isn't he?
Definitely,
he really does pull a lot of strings with Carcetti, and Carcetti is quite, is pretty convinced.
He almost masquerades as being, underneath Carcetti in terms of rank. In many ways, he's actually above him, in the way that he's able to control him and almost manipulate his emotions to sort of dangle that gubernatorial position throughout Season 5 to get him to do the selfish thing. So obviously one of the examples here is with the governor. And yeah, it's a bleak situation. Obviously, that this deficit is hanging right over them, and he's given the choice of sort of complete austerity, cancelling all his pay rise promises, or begging for more state money. And Nerys in this instance actually makes a pretty good suggestion for that purpose.
It's also worth mentioning that also introduced to us here is that more than just a property developer, it seems that Andy Krawcheck is the school board president, apparently, or a school, sort of on the school board, it seems. Yeah,
it's an odd thing to see, isn't it? He seems to have his fingers in all sorts of pies. That may well be why there's such a big hole in the budget here.
Yes, because obviously we know that he's a bit of a tricksy fellow with his money. Clearly doing some swindling here and there. So not a especially trustworthy person to have in that position, but he does just kind of turn up here and you're like, oh, I guess he's must be related to the school board. So there it is.
Yeah.
We also have Campbell, like you say, making a good suggestion about the governor, but also just constantly so combative in all of these political situations. I think it certainly starts to become as tiring for me as I think it does for Carcetti.
Yeah, she makes a big drama out of things that could be dealt with through a lot more diplomacy, definitely, doesn't she? There's still a lot of personal grudge playing through this, what should be this politics, really. So, not the best situation for Carcetti at all.
And then we end up with them obviously going along with that advice and going to the State House, going to see the governor. Of course, there's some really horrible, syrupy version of Silent Night playing in the background to allude to the fact that all is silent in the State House and they're not hearing anything from them. So,
yeah, it so perfectly drags out this epically long wait, doesn't it? Yeah. It's the perfect accompaniment.
It's that kind of music that's so like lilting and calming in a situation that is anything but, that it actually, the music itself, it becomes unintentionally kind of aggravating and offensive.
Yeah. Another really good use of that non-diegetic music.
Yeah.
And oh dear, it's obviously a nice way to bring us into the Christmas theme. I don't think any other part of the show, any other part of the series really has set around Christmas, and they're certainly trying to flag that up. And
well, we'll point out in several other areas throughout the episode, I'm sure, but this is one of those good points at which, again, showing rather than telling. The show does a really good job of demonstrating where we are in the year without having characters go, well, it's Christmas coming soon. You don't need
what
to
are
do
you
that.
Getting for Christmas?
Exactly, yeah. It kind of can point it out in other ways. And we have the music here, and just for one example, Bubbles has some tinsel and a Father Christmas mask on his trolley. So it just
and then, of course,
shows us.
The opening scene of the finale is a close-up of Landsman's Christmas tie. So it's all this sort of stuff, which is, as you say, very, very clever. And no need to sort of shove it in our faces.
Unfortunately, what is being shoved in our faces is the fact that the governor is, messing around with Carcetti here. Clearly just making him wait.
It's more of a huge slap in the face, isn't it, really, when they leave? Definitely.
So they sort of get nearly out the door until the security guard stops them. And as I'm sure you might have seen as well, it's interesting that the security guard that tells them that the governor is ready was, at the time, the real Maryland governor.
Yeah.
The guy playing that security guard, was the governor of Maryland at the time.
It's very cool.
Robert Ehrlich, I believe it's pronounced. Yeah.
They also offered that cameo to Martin O'Malley himself, who wasn't the governor at the time. Would have been, and he did decline that role. So, again, a classic Wire cameo moment. Very meta. And I love how Norman never fails to sort of maintain these silver linings moments, and we won't go until we get some, we won't go. Yeah, so it's that was a nice laugh for me.
Yeah, I really like that bit too. The only thing I thought was a bit odd, and again we're talking about people having loud conversations, they do seem to be having that conversation about the governor very loudly within his own halls with all of his staff walking around them. I did think that was a bit odd, but again, maybe that's perfectly normal, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe the size of that hall is just so massive that it's hard to say really unless you're in that situation. But yeah, that's very true. You would want to keep it on the down low if you've got lots of gripes to get off your chest.
I guess there is the point that the volume of that conversation and the almost announced departure that they make is also perhaps instrumental in them finally getting some FaceTime with the governor.
Yeah, or maybe Silent Night was turned up to 11 and they could have just spoken without worrying.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just blasted in everyone's ears. Yeah, and of course, I guess one of the most important things is what's actually not seen, the fact that we get to see all the waiting, but we don't actually get to see the meat. We don't get to see the big moment where he sees the governor. We don't even get to see the governor himself.
Yeah.
So we're left to hear the potentially biased version of events from Carcetti's recount in the next budget meeting. So, classic Wire building you up for a little bit of disappointment there.
And then in our final little bit where they're discussing this, Campbell again sees the fact that the governor can see Carcetti coming, in that sense, wants to make him look bad for taking the money, and we sort of have some dissenting levels of opinion on what he should actually do considering the situation, and here Steindorf proves the convincing one to Carcetti.
Yeah, is this another impossible dilemma? Do you get behind the kids or do you get behind the economy? And there's this big web of motivations beyond the pure issue of the schools, and particularly personal ones, as we were mentioning, particularly with Nerisse. She doesn't want him to take it because she's relying on Carcetti's governing position being approved for her to become the next mayor. So already there's lots and lots of personal goals that are muddying the waters. And it's very cheeky how she says she's happy that she's not the mayor right now, despite the fact that that's her very intention, as she expressed to Carcetti not too long ago.
Yeah, I hope she realises what she's saying. And she's going to, if he wants to be mayor, she's going to be in this position, and she's going to have to deal with this sort of thing. So maybe
although
in
for me,
that
it's
sense,
going to be different, right? It's going to be different for me. That's what everyone thinks. So
yeah. Right, so that's our politics section, or politics strand.
All right,
anything
nice and quick.
Want to see with that all in one go? Anything else you want to say about it before we head over to the Western District?
I think that captured all of it, definitely, yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at the Western then. This is dealing with quite a lot of different things, but it does cover the whole Western District. So here we go. Kenard arrives at Namond's corner, late for work, and finds Namond getting his hair braided. Namond rebukes Kenard's tardiness, and Kenard says they are going to have the day off. He asks Namond for a private word and tells him that their stash has been stolen from his basement. He claims that the door was kicked in by the police and that someone must have given away the location. Namond accepts his excuse and the assurance that Kenard will try to find the informant. Namond later discusses his problem with Michael, and Michael insists that Kenard must have stolen the stash for himself and tells Namond that he should check the door to prove Kenard's story false, and then confront him with more than words. On the way home from school, Namond asks Michael to accompany him when he confronts Kenard, and Namond later tells his mother that he suspects Kenard took the stash. She insists that Kenard needs to feel some pain for his actions, and Namond tries to argue with her, but she's very disappointed that he has not acted already and ends up hitting him, and so Namond rushes from the house.
Yeah.
So Kenard is a sneaky little shit, isn't he?
Oh man, just such a really dislikable character, isn't he? No redeeming features that would ever suggest he may be being honest about his explanation here.
Yeah,
Certainly.
I don't know about you, but I didn't believe him the first time I saw this. I think it's pretty obvious that he's done Namond here.
I think there's almost an element that he is making it obvious to Namond. It's almost like I'm testing you now. I've seen that you don't really stand up when the heat gets tough, and I'm not going to play subtle with you here. I'm kind of going to imply something, and I bet you're not going to act on it. And he doesn't see Michael coming at all, I guess, but otherwise he was correct. Otherwise, Namond would have let him off the hook here. Really, he's too soft.
I guess it's trying to make a point as well that he happens to come across Namond whilst he's getting his hair braided, and the last time they discussed hair, Kenard's response was less than helpful.
Yeah. What was it again? Oh, faggy.
Do I look like a faggy? Or maybe it's faggot, kind of just
with
in
the accent. Yeah.
But
I prefer faggy.
Faggy. So I mean, maybe
man.
this is sort of a not necessarily offensive, but kind of a harsher sounding conversation to our American friends, because to us, a fag is a cigarette and a faggot is a parcel of meat. So that doesn't really mean anything to us, but we get what's going on, obviously.
Oh yeah, we've heard enough American TV and film to it's kind of come over here as well.
But it's just it's a strange turn of phrase, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Kenard, it seems nice that there's that continued connection with him and Namond, and he happens to come upon him when he's dealing with his hair once again. So I guess he's picking up on the very different techniques that the two of them have, and he proves to be very right as well. I mean, Namond is just not cut out for this at all, and far too trusting.
I like that you. The thing is, I don't think he believed him at all from the start, but he just didn't have the balls to really challenge him on it. That's the problem, really. And I like that you established the hair as a sort of metaphor for him giving in to the allure of the streets, and he's refusing to let the streets define him. He's come up with a pretty decent compromise here. Obviously not willing to part with his hair, but willing to get it braided to get it obviously flattened down and make him a little bit less conspicuous.
Just like with the corner,
Yeah.
He's going off and find somewhere new. He's not going to give up entirely, but he's also not going to actually do what, quote unquote, being hard on the street requires him to do. So, yeah, it's just another one of those concessions that he thinks is going to help him through, but reality hits home instead.
Yeah, definitely. And we never get to meet this snitch-ass bitch that Kenard mentions, who snuck into the basement. But, just because snitching is the talk of the town at the moment, a la Randy, doesn't mean that he's going to buy it here, definitely. So, yeah. Kenard, not a convincing an explanation, I'm sorry. And of course, obviously, street code would enforce that Namond challenge Kenard there and then, Even if it was someone who broke into his apartment, it's still his responsibility. You'd need to demand that Kenard covers this loss immediately to, impose that dominance. And Kenard, in some ways there's complications because Kenard isn't paid nearly enough, and he's a little baby. Like, it's a different ball game than when you actually have like kind of a developed hopper. And yeah, it's just overall Namond getting played. Namond isn't hardened enough to challenge it, and it's a real good, showing of what Namond really is. That his actual his sort of sense of warmth inside, really, compared to a lot of people. And I really like how the election campaign posters are still neglectfully sitting around the neighbourhood here. They're sort of fading and ripping as time goes on.
Continuing with the education theme as well, we have Michael schooling Namond on what he should be doing. Obviously got a far better mind for the street, so is telling him what needs to happen, and that he knows full well that Namond is full of plenty of words, but maybe not as many actions, and puts that upon him. You need to go there and actually show him what you mean rather than simply telling him.
Yeah, and I like how Michael's really regurgitating some Chris mannerisms and some wisdom nuggets here. So stuff like, you got to step two, put something real behind them words. There's sort of an element of wisdom to those lines, and you sense that Michael would have been skeptical before he was being trained up, but there's just this emotional disconnection and sort of robotic delivery that puts him at a distance from a lot of the good stuff that he's actually saying. So, like Chris, it's conflicted. Despite the lack of emotion, he's ultimately looking out for his friends here, and it means that it's hard to dislike him for that reason. Like, he's still a very likable character, despite the fact that, as Namond says, Mike isn't Michael no more. Like, it's a really weird situation.
Definitely, yeah. And then to finish off this little section, we get further confirmation that Delonda is just awful. This is how you pay me back for all the love I show, she says, citing the fact that he always had new trainers as an example.
Yeah.
Namond is right about Weebay. You know, what he did got him locked up. And he doesn't want to be part of that. He doesn't want to go down that same line. And once again, her only response is to just kind of shout at him and insult him and end up hitting him. And, you know, Namond is right to walk out, I think.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Just breaking into tears, you know, completely understandable. And, of course, this is the third of our boys being forced out of their homes. We saw Dukie earlier. Michael mentioned it, and now we see Namond leaving for what looks like for good here, really. This is a real turning point. Delonda really just not backing down and having the harshest encounter yet. And obviously Randy's not far away around the corner from leaving his home. But yeah, just horrible situation.
Right, shall we move on to the next section?
Yeah.
So following on from this, Namond confronts Kenard and tells him that he knows he stole the package. However, Kenard remains unafraid of Namond and verbally taunts him. Annoyed, Michael eventually steps in and brutally beats Kenard into a bloody pulp. Namond is shocked and refuses to recover his package and runs away from the scene. Namond arrives at Cutty's gym and gets the cold shoulder from Michael. The next day, he provokes Michael into attacking him by picking on Dukie, and Cutty intervenes, telling Michael to leave. Namond then breaks down in tears, and Cutty calls Carver for help. They ask Namond what has happened between him and Michael, and Namond also mentions the fact that he is forced to live up to his father's reputation. Cutty confesses to Carver that he is angry with himself for sending Michael away. Cutty then visits Michael's mother and learns that he has moved out, and Carver calls Colvin for help after Namond's mother refuses to pick him up. Cutty later tracks Michael down to a corner with Monk. Monk orders Cutty away, but he tells Monk that he's not talking to him, so Monk shoots Cutty twice in the leg. Michael does prevent him from killing him, however. Michael offers to stay with Cutty until the ambulance comes, but Cutty tells him to go with his people.
Yeah, so quite a lot happens there. Wow.
Yeah, a lot of bits and lots of little bits and bobs.
Yeah, so obviously the first bit where, you know, Namond's at the moment, rather than facing the truth that his operation has a massive leak, he's avoiding the drama, and he realises that Michael might be his only solution to that, and to help him discipline a 7, 8, 9-year-old, so they don't get out of hand. You know, having said that, Kenard is a special kind of scary. He certainly scares me, and it's interesting how he's actually nice to Dukie when he's trying to hunt Michael's support here, unlike later on. Clearly, all part of his plan.
Yeah, this is a a really quite brutal scene. Sort of seeing this young kid. I mean, Kenard, like you say, he is quite a scary character. He's almost like is it Sean Williams? Do you remember that person, that guy that Colvin gets out to show to Parenti, as sort of being too seasoned or whatever?
Yeah, he could be a 10 years time Kenard, definitely.
Yeah, not too far off, that's for sure. I mean, we get into a slightly different conversation if we're going to start talking about whether or not he deserved it. I mean, either way, it's always going to be incredibly shocking to see a child getting beaten to a pulp like that.
Yeah.
It certainly shocks the hell out of Namond, and I think he's not the only one who's feeling a bit chilled by what he's just seen. I mean, Michael ain't Michael anymore, as he says. This is a far more colder person that we're seeing here, clearly affected by his training that he's getting from the Stanfields. You know, just take your package so that we can go.
Yeah.
Literally and at last, Namond is running away from this situation. He now no longer he's finally leaving the street behind.
Yeah, but first through his mum and now through Michael as well, like his friends. He's running out of people to really, seek at this point. And as you say, the beat up scene is very shocking. It's clear that he's not just been taught the physical skills to be a soldier, but also this mindset of what responses and retorts can be accepted almost, and which can't. And it's almost this kind of knee-jerk reaction here, because Kenard talks back to Namond in a certain way. It's almost as if he's finely tuned to respond to that with violence, because you can't let that stuff fly. And of course, the repeated punch to the face is this eerie Chris trademark, which we saw not too long ago, and it sort of does appear to sort of carry out in a similar fashion.
There is more than an echo of Michael's father's death here.
Yeah, it's almost as if Michael was there to sort of spy on this satisfying moment for him, and is sort of, it's almost ingrained in his memory, and he's sort of just bringing it back up almost. It's really weird. And,
especially the shot of the kid's face as well. Like, there is a kind of a somewhat reminiscent of what we end up with, a slightly worse situation perhaps with Michael's father, but these repeated blows to the head and everything, like you say, perhaps it is a bit of a trademark.
Yeah. And of course Namond's understandably out of his depth, running out of these safety nets, as I mentioned. Mum and Michael aren't safe in his eyes anymore. So Bunny can't come and adopt him any sooner, really. That's kind of almost the next place to run to.
Because he does go to Cutty's gym first, and essentially tries to provoke Michael into attacking him. Do you think that he's doing this to kind of make a point to Cutty, or I'm not 100% on exactly why he wants Michael to attack him?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think it's a plea for help from Namond that he's thought through. So he knows that it will involve him having to turn against both Dukie and Michael, but he knows that it will get Michael to respond in a violent way, and therefore it will give him a reason to break down, and therefore Cutty, who he knows to be a person who looks out for the community, will come and help him. And it works. It completely works, because Carver comes along, takes him to, basically it gets him adopted in some ways. It sort of sets that in motion. So if it is a plea for help, it works. It really does.
We were talking before about all the kids getting kicked out of their home in some way. You've kind of already mentioned for Michael, but I would add that although I would say that he's also kicked out of Cutty's gym here, which is certainly more than a home than his other one ever was.
Yeah.
Although he has now found a new home, it does feel like there's a kicking out going on here as well. Even if Cutty does try to make reparations that don't really come around.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And of course, we haven't mentioned the fact that the way that Michael again just knee-jerk reaction, violence, as soon as Namond gives him a reason, a fairly flimsy one about Dukie, and he just treats this violence as a second nature, which is horrible, but it seems to be instilling him with this sort of intense sense of loyalty to those who are close to him and vulnerable, and obviously it's all based around his protection for Dukie here, and it's a nicer trait if it's channeled correctly. So as I've already mentioned, it's a very conflicted Chris Partlow-esque transition he's going through here. He's kind of developing that moral complexity that we know Chris has. So yeah, very, very odd, and certainly not Michael that we used to know. Yeah.
So then,
as you say,
then we kind of have Namond talking about his father's reputation, which is obviously well understood to Carver and Cutty, and they can they know exactly what they're looking at when they see Namond. They understand where he's coming from, so it's good that he still has those people around him who know him and know his situation. And one shudders to think that if he wasn't in a position to be at the gym or to be in any kind of contact with someone like Carver, that he'd be in a very similar situation to Dukie. And in that way, Namond's situation is, sort of kind of as maybe not on the same level as tragedy as some of the other kids, but there is still a lot to sympathise with. He just happens to be far more fortunate in his circumstances. Yeah,
and it is very, very, he's very fortunate that there is this Cutty and Carver pastoral care team almost that arrived to sort of cradle him in their arms after his plea for help. And incredible when you step out of the situation and think of where these two, Cutty and Carver, were at the start of last season, how far both of them have come, and they're such mature beacons of this community now. They seem to be upholding the community almost, and they came from much less savoury beginnings. And of course they then try to phone the next of kin, and the logical thing to do, and predictably enough, Delonda's response is put that bitch in baby booking.
Yeah.
Which is just, wow.
And so at the end of that we have Cutty tracking down Michael. I do like the fact that he's still not going to be fearful out on the streets. Boy, if I was talking to you, you'd know it. Which is just great, but I don't think Monk, as we know, is going to stand for that, and as a result, he ends up getting shot for it.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that, Cutty turning Michael away is yet another tragedy here, because Michael has not trusted Cutty at all since he met him, and here it feels like finally he realizes that Cutty isn't a bad guy and that he is genuinely just trying to help him, and he wants to stick around, and any sort of possibilities or connections here are severed anyway, because Cutty is just like, he's resigned on that fact now. He's now letting him go with his people. So it's kind of a lost opportunity there, which is really, really sad.
Yeah, he certainly doesn't like Cutty, does he? He, as he puts it, he's too friendly for his liking. But he's still innocent enough to know that he doesn't deserve to die over this, what is, some bullshit. So it is, again, very likeable that he hangs around for the ambo. And it's odd how Michael does have quite a commanding presence here. Monk follows his call at every step.
I was about to say, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they don't seem to be particularly perturbed by the fact that he's showing compassion and that he's waiting around with them, despite the fact that the police is, the sirens are coming. Perhaps Monk respects that it's his beef to manage, and that Cutty was coming after Michael, and therefore Michael can deal with it in the way he wants to. But yeah, he's clearly commanding a lot of respect very early in his career with the Stanfields.
Perhaps also we don't know Monk well enough to say whether or not he would be a hardliner in this kind of situation. So it's not totally unreasonable, I think. But it is telling that that Michael is able to, physically lower the weapon of this long-standing Stanfield organisation member.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. That's kind of the cornerstone of it, isn't it? And very clever. And Monk is just, so well cast. It's just the brutality that he kind of permeates into the air is just wow. And very brave of Cutty to go up to these guys like this and try and reconcile with Michael. Unfortunately, his name doesn't ring out anymore, and he doesn't anticipate how brutal these streets have become.
And similarly, we are just kind of left with this. We don't get any kind of closure on this particular bit in this episode.
Yeah, got to wait for the climax next time. All right, so I imagine there's one more Western District, is there?
That's right. We get to what is essentially the final bit of the episode, if you like, and perhaps our most tragic. So Carver visits Randy at home, tries to reassure that the danger will soon pass. He tells Miss Anna that they still have plainclothes officers watching the house. And later, a false shooting is called in from Randy's street to lure away the police unit guarding his house. Two people approach Miss Anna's house and throw Molotov cocktails through the window. Carver visits the hospital and later learns that Miss Anna is in a critical but stable condition with third-degree burns. He tries to console Randy, but the boy rejects him. Carver attempts to assure Randy that he will be protected, but as Carver leaves, Randy taunts him bitterly.
Yeah.
So the tragedies are really starting to compound now in this episode. But in the case of Randy, he is a good example of perhaps unintentional, just system failure for him. He's been let down by two primary systems in the city, with the police and the school. He's been unfortunately let down by both of them, and his taunts come across as so bitter as a result. And now he's going to be heading back to the other system that scarred him in the first place, social services. And he's just getting bumped around from pillar to post, being told people are going to help. It's not happening. Yeah, he's just ended up in this really terrible, unfortunate situation. And I kind of feel for Carver as well. I mean, this isn't his fault or anything. He's really tried to do the best that he can and gone very much above and beyond the call of duty in his position. But all he can do is walk away. What else can he do in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot more he could have done, is there, really? And obviously, when you're in that situation, you don't feel like that. There's always going to be that burden of responsibility that you should have done more, and he doesn't deserve to feel like that at all. But you can see that for both Randy and Carver, it's almost equally distressing. And yeah, it's clearly the high drama moment of the episode. And I mean, there's plenty of signs of the problems already. It's not Carver's problem, but it's the fact that the watchmen have clearly been napping all night. There's when he brings the donuts out over in the morning, they seem to be very sort of turned off to everything. And there's a limit to how fast they can react if someone does try and do something. And obviously, the Molotov cocktail thing is something they just weren't prepared for and probably should have been, but how could they? You know, there's so many questions that you can ask and ways you can try and do it over. But it's just the limitation of what you can do as a policeman. Really, it's not a foolproof system. And it's what's even sadder is the way they established Carver's responsibility on his morning visit, and it's great to see how much he's put into this thing he feels responsible for. Again, it's a tragic setup for the real pear-shaped ending that he's going to get. So, yeah, good stuff. Well, not good stuff at all.
Good stuff in terms of TV drama, but not good for our characters, unfortunately. And Randy is completely broken by this point.
Yeah, and then of course, I guess the way the evening pans out, we have the call in for Pennsylvania and Gold just around the corner. We assume these cops fell for it. You know, that an urgent call nearby. If they'd have thought about it for a bit longer, maybe they would have realised it's a setup. But you know, it's hard to avoid an urgent call on the radio like that. Someone else getting played, and I like how there are a few Christmas lights along Randy's road. Sort of shows they're in the part of town where the streets are slightly more cared for and treasured by the residents. But of course, there's the Molotov cocktails. There's no noise from the house. We have to assume that Miss Anna was in her lounge at the time, which is why she got so instantly smoshed from those flames. And they engulfed the room instantly in such a violent way as well. There's obviously no screams or noises. Just there's no playing up the drama like they did with the stray shooting in season 2.
I always assumed that they were like asleep upstairs, and that they didn't hear that, and the fire just engulfed the house so fast that it was too late for them to escape unharmed. Yeah,
that is true. I mean, it did look like those flames would have spread really quickly. I'm sure those houses aren't the most fireproof, so yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And there's no explanation of the coordination and planning of this attack, but clearly no one is going to be forgetting about Randy. I guess is there potential that Marlowe went back on his consideration to keep Randy on the street for the time being? There is that question raised that perhaps the Stanfields are behind this. Nonetheless, we switch straight to Prop Joe's cigar light after this scene, which is a nice transition.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say that we go from the blaze at the house to the flame itself. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, this leads to our final scene of the episode, which is where the full emotional heft of what's happened comes into play, and that's kind of the real Pelicanosed moment, I guess. The word on the street runs too deep.
And we get that kind of chilling long walk for Carver as he goes down that sort of pure white hallway.
And this is obviously developed from what Prez said to him a couple of episodes ago about don't speak to the police. And Carver's like, is that going to help me? Like, at this point, am I already too far gone? And the answer is yes, but Prez can't answer him. And in the same way here, he's asking a similar question in a much more dramatic and stressful sense, and there is no answer to be given. I like how there's no need to heighten the sentiment. We don't get to see Miss Anna, the words on the whiteboard that explain her critical condition, do all the talking, which is far more chilling, to be honest.
Right, so anything else that you want to say for the Western District?
No, I think that's everything. Obviously, kind of the emotional centre of this episode.
Yeah, there's a lot of really heavy stuff going on there.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it doesn't get much lighter as we move on to Bubbles.
Okay, let's have a look.
So again, I'll be doing this all in one. So Bubbles visits the horse's yard to talk to the Arabas he sometimes works for. He asks for advice about how to deal with his tormentor. They have various suggestions for him, but settle on replacing drugs with sodium cyanide to poison the man. They tell him that a metal plating shop is an easy place to buy the chemical, and that the only issue will be living with himself, as the police will not question the death of an addict. Having bought the necessary chemical, Bubbles prepares several vials of the stuff and then goes out to work. Sherrod arrives and Bubbles tells him that he is giving him his own stock and route. Bubbles warns him not to resist their tormentor if held up again. And when he returns to the garage after a long day at work without incident, he finds Sherrod's takings on the table. Bubbles awakes the next day and is horrified to find that Sherrod has shot up some of the vials that he prepared. And Bubbles weeps over Sherrod's dead body. So yeah, we've kind of come through, a really, I guess it has been a very tragic season for Bubbles so far. I mean, we've spoken several times before that we're obviously not a fan of what's going on with the Fiend, and I guess it's good that we didn't see anything of him in this episode. That a lot of what's going on with Bubbles is very much about this guy and how we can solve the problem, but he doesn't actually feature, which is good in a way. But that doesn't stop the tragedy from happening to him, and sort of just digging Bubbles further into this hole, and seems even more alone now that he's lost Sherrod, especially as it has unintentionally been done by his own hand. Yeah.
Interesting that we get to see the Arabas stabling area. I don't think we've seen these guys before. Very much calling ahead to Bubbles' successor, Dukie, who settles down with these guys in the same place next season. There's obviously some interesting wisdom up in this place, a lot of street knowledge that's been gained over many years, a lot of old guys. We hear the full lesson on how to make a hot shot, as we saw the full effects of this in Season 2 in the prison, with the rat poison. It's not a bad plan at all, considering the guy's beating on him for sort of 7 episodes on the trot here, and it feels like it's kind of inevitable what the nasty, wire-esque twist in the tale will be here before it even happens. There's this somewhat inevitability that Sherrod is going to end up grabbing the hot shot. I think that one can be seen coming from quite a way off. Interesting how the Arabas are saying that the only thing you have to worry about is living with yourself. These guys are of an age where conscience does cost. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not. They're certainly not of the new age where death don't mean a thing. So yeah, good to see a new little community in the Western District here.
Yeah, that's right. Seeing something a little bit extra, and again, continued tragedy as we see that all Bubbles is going to have to deal with is his own conscience. And boy, does he deal with it. But he deals with it not quite the way that he might have planned. As once again, he knows that nobody's going to be sort of investigating or troubling themselves over the death of an addict. And in a sort of cruel twist of fate, he ends up dealing, like I say, with his conscience in a totally different and far worse way.
Yeah, and I mean everything with Bubs and Sherrod this episode is on a high, isn't it? I mean that they're having an extra happy relationship with one another this episode. Bubs is trusting him for the first time to take his own depot to a different part of town, obviously with ulterior motives in mind with that, but makes for an extra painful crash, as with a lot of the things they've done this episode. And just as Sherrod is developing the skills to sort of be independent is the moment he crashes out of the show. So, yeah, sad. But what's not so sad and a little bit more annoying is Bubs just... What is he doing leaving that tainted pill on Sherrod's bedside table? Like, leave it in a pocket, stuff it down the side of your bed. Like, they allude to the fact that Sherrod is kind of playing at being asleep here, I think, and probably takes it as soon as Bubs drifts off. And there's those classic moments where you don't realise the person's dead. It's a bit of a trope, really. The positive ramblings of the morning turn to pain after like 5 minutes of assumed like consciousness. So yeah, but I think it's ridiculous that the mistake Bubs makes there. It's pretty unforgivable.
I think one of our listeners made the point, I can't remember if it was by YouTube or email, I apologise for not remembering who said it and where, but I seem to recall someone mentioned in a comment to us about how the repeated showings of the Fiend sort of troubling Bubbles was there to, in part, demonstrate that Bubbles had tried all of these various methods or whatever, various dealings to try and solve the problem and had, as a result, been forced into killing him and trying to find some poison way, which in turn puts us in the situation with Sherrod. So that's something to consider in terms of how we have got here. But I think it's perhaps worth being called slightly into question as to why he's leaving these poison vials in an easily available space. Somewhere where Sherrod perhaps thinks that this is something that is being made available to him. You think he... Yeah. I can see why he wouldn't want to tell him about it, but you think he would also, as a result, take the proper caution to ensure that he's not taking them himself, seeing as we already know that he has been on the stuff himself.
Yep. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you could try and justify it. When you're tired and it's late, you don't think too hard about what you're doing. You want to go to sleep and stuff, but damn, this could have been so easily avoided, and I think it does taint the pain of the scene a bit by the stupidity of what he does the night before. I think it is a little bit unforgivable.
Also, I seem to recall when I first watched it, when Bubbles is there and is kind of getting up and very much talking to himself, I remember sitting there thinking, oh god, he's not actually, Sherrod's not sort of shot up the poisoned heroin, has he? Yep, that's exactly what's
absolutely
happened.
That contributes to the element of this one being sort of, being seen a mile off, doesn't it?
It's not a surprise in the sense that when you sort of explicitly find out, you are shocked in that sense. It does ruin its own surprise a little bit, I think.
And like with a lot of the things that happen this episode, the full emotional climax will not be seen until next episode. In fact, at the very start of next episode, we see Bubbles try and hang himself in the interrogation room at the homicide department.
Oh yeah, so it gets worse for Bubbles. It gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah, he actually reaches the bottom that Waylon mentioned back in season 1. Next episode, and of course Waylon then comes and collects him and inaugurates him into the NA group, which brings him out of that bottom into a positive future. So
got to see that bottom coming up at him.
Yeah, of course this is a horrible moment for Bubs, but let's have some solace in the fact that he is actually one of the better off characters by the end of the season. He actually has one of the best endings. So, yeah.
Okay, so if you're ready, we can move on to our final strand.
Yep, Omar.
Yep. So, Omar and Ronaldo continue to follow Cheese, tracking him to a meeting with Stanfield's people. Marlowe pays Cheese more than expected and requests a bigger shipment of narcotics. Cheese is reluctant to promise anything and tells Marlowe that he will discuss it with Prop Joe. He gives Monk a burner phone and tells him that they will call when they have the drugs. Stanfield's people, however, are newly dubious about using phones, and Cheese reassures them that they do not have to answer the call. The call itself will serve as the signal that the meeting is ready. Omar organises a meeting at Butchie's bar to put a team together, and Butchie offers him the men who helped Omar while in jail as muscle, but Omar declines, telling Butchie that he hopes to be more subtle. His old associate Kimmy arrives and receives a warm welcome. So yeah, just kind of setting up our heist, if you like, by having this extended shipment be ordered, with Cheese being involved, and obviously Omar putting together a team for something a little special and more subtle, as he puts it.
Yeah, it's obviously thinking outside the box, isn't he, Omar, now, and getting Kimmy back in for a little cameo catch-up is kind of cool.
We kind of have two meetings to start our tale, don't we?
Yeah, so it's just a scene with Cheese and then a scene with Butchie. It certainly makes sense when you consider how obviously shady Butchie's boys are. It does make sense that Omar would want to find a more subtle way of doing things, and Kimmy would be a much more plausible distraction, or have a more plausible involvement with this heist or this practical joke that he's playing. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool. I like the chat they have with Cheese. Cheese seems to prove himself a bit more than he normally does. He shows that he's got a bit of business acumen and street smarts, and he convinces the crew quite nicely. It's nice that he's sort of non-committal about the big order that they ask for. Ensures that Marlowe is sort of being properly set up without giving him anything to be concerned about. And
Cheese's laid-back attitude not really washing with the Stanfield guys. Obviously, you're a bit more sort of deadpan and serious.
Yeah. And I like how Omar reuses the season 1 line, "The cheese stands alone." This time, of course, the cheese actually referring to cheese rather than, I think it refers to money in the original context. So, yeah, nothing too much to say about these set-up meetings, though.
I quite like Marlowe's short someone else then. He's just kind of like, fuck everyone else, like just short someone else, I'm more important. Like,
yeah.
It's just kind of like that sort of casual, just short someone else.
Self-importance, just assumed self-importance, isn't it? Yeah. It's really telling of him, certainly.
Right, so we do our very last section then.
Okay.
So Omar continues to follow Cheese as he prepares to deliver the new shipment to Marlowe. Prop Joe calls to tell Omar where he can steal from Marlowe as promised, but Omar doesn't take the call, knowing that he's onto a greater payload now. He, Ronaldo, and Kimmy tail Cheese's van to a meeting place. Kimmy is dressed as a prostitute, much to the amusement of Omar. Cheese and his associates prepare to load the shipment into the van. Kimmy approaches one of the guards and tries to distract him with the offer of sexual favours, whilst Ronaldo's people arrive posing as painters and block Cheese's van in. The trap is then sprung, and Omar demands that they open the truck. Later, Cheese reports the theft to Prop Joe, and Joe worries that the co-op will think that he is withholding the shipment for himself. So, yeah, things starting to look very bleak for Prop Joe now, which is unfortunate given how much we do love the man, but this is a really, really unfortunate situation that he's found himself in here. I do feel like maybe this... do you not feel like maybe the steal, the heist on this shipment is a tad easy?
Yeah, it's a bit anticlimactic. Like it feels like this big... what should be this big penultimate episode caper, and it's over within 20 seconds, isn't it? Really, it's a very simple plan, but it's executed well. It's a good enough plan. I mean, it kind of shows that true espionage is kind of a thing of the movies and the rest of it. But I like how the guy calls them amateurs as he's sort of marched onto the van at gunpoint, and Omar laughing at how wrong he is. That's right, yeah. Omar laughing at how wrong he really is. And of course, Prop Joe, respectfully as he is, I've got to hand it to Mr. Little. I didn't see him coming on this front. He's already double-crossed him. And of course, yeah, I guess that's it. So we had Ronaldo on the roof, Kimmy posing as the distraction prostitute, and then Omar coming up from the side, as he always does. And that's all they need to do, and they've pretty much got the co-op cornered. And as Prop Joe would put it, he stirred up a right hornet's nest, and there's no telling who's going to get stung. And they spend enough time to work out, Omar spent enough time to work out that all the drug trade was egged in one basket now, as he put it. So the ramifications of a hold-up are going to be much more crippling to the whole drug trade now. And Prop Joe ought to be very worried. And of course, next episode, this shipment being taken is going to be instrumental in reeling the Greeks back into the fold, potentially getting the Greeks interested in working with Marlowe rather than Prop Joe. And as the rest of the co-op says quite rightly, as Joe says, the co-op is obviously going to question Prop Joe's leadership position following this event. So a lot of things very quickly suddenly look quite bleak for Prop Joe, who has otherwise been in a very commanding position all the way through the series.
I can only put it down to complacency, given the situation, like you say, I mean, with all of the sort of slices of the pie, if you like, being part of one massive shipment. That there isn't more caution surrounding where it's going and its transport, and the fact that random people can turn up at this site where it's happening. No one seems particularly concerned that there's this random prostitute walking through, and then we have these painters randomly show up, and they seem kind of more like, oh, what are you doing here, rather than people have stumbled across our massive drug shipment. Like, it doesn't seem to be of a particular concern to them, which is a bit odd, but like I say, I can only put it down to complacency in the fact that they've perhaps had it quite easy for so long, and don't expect Omar to be coming at them.
Exactly. That they, as far as they're concerned, they've got all the important powers in the west side of the city on their side, so they'd have no reason to necessarily expect a drug bust of this sort. This is the olden day way of doing things, where everyone battled over territory. This battling has stopped. We've got all of our eggs in one basket. But of course, Omar runs his own ship. He's loyal to no one really, and he's the perfect sort of candidate to actually completely stir up this cooperative effort they've got going on.
So yeah, like you say, it's not looking very good for Joe.
Nope. All right. Anything else to say on the episode?
Just double check here. So, I think it's worth mentioning that we do feel very far away from the hijinks of summer. We are a very long way from where we started as we approach our finale here. And you really do feel it, not just with all of these nods to Christmas, but just, like you say, how far all of these characters have come, for better or for worse.
Definitely, and as I was saying at the start, I was saying it's sort of a less memorable Pelicano's penultimate episode of the bunch. There's not a major death as in Wallace, Frank or Stringer, but I certainly wouldn't use that to actually speak against the masterful construction of the four kids' fates here. The fact that all four of them end up having to be forced out of their homes for quite, very varied reasons, really. It's a wonderfully told and crafted tale. And really, really nicely set up for the major beats that we're going to see in the extended finale next week. So, I think it's one of the best bits of storytelling in the whole series. Definitely, the focus on the four kids in this episode.
Right. Well, it's a mammoth of an episode, that's for sure, and we certainly got a lot out of that. If there's nothing else that you want to say about the episode as a whole, then I think we're done for our recap and can take a look at our final sections.
Yep, let's have a look.
What you need to use is that sodium cyanide. That shit looks and cooks just like the real thing.
I find that.
Try, Mentors over there by the tracks. One of those metal shops where they do plate.
How much I need?
It ain't gonna take much. A vial of that shit'll kill every horse in this state.
That's all there is to it?
It ain't no thing to kill a nigga who's already about the business of killing himself. And the police, they ain't gonna pay no never mind. You the ones got to live with it's all.
So our title, That's Got His Own, is a rather unusual title. I think if you asked me to name season 4 episodes, I probably wouldn't remember the name of this one.
No.
Even though it is, a pretty important episode. The title itself is a lyric from a song by Billie Holiday. But I didn't really tie it to too much else. I guess there's sort of the guardianship over the kids.
Yeah, you need to have your own. It's almost referring directly to the Donnelly conversation, I think, most directly. Suggestions of parenting, having a kid of your own. Ironic in the sense that all four kids actually leave their family units this episode for various reasons. But I think Bunny and Prez, obviously, it's speaking to most closely. As Prez more directly this episode, and Bunny more directly next episode, where he actually goes and fosters Namond. So not too much else, as you say, I can tie it to either, really.
Well, let's move on to our epigraph then. So it's from Bubbles. this week. That all there is to it, he says, which is when he's inquiring about the possibility of poisoning his tormentor. I guess this is looking at the element of simplicity in causing all of these difficulties and complex difficulties coming out of really simple catalysts. So, for example, firebombing Randy's home and everything that happens as a result of that. I mean, it really is just as simple as there is a simplicity to just throwing some bottles filled with alcohol, through the window, and that's it. That's his whole. It's not just the house, and it's not just kind of some means of tarnishing his reputation or whatever. That is literally his whole life, just ruined now.
Yeah,
and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, that's a very nice reading. Obviously, the direct version is with Bubbles and the discovery that killing someone is actually not necessarily that complicated, but it can also be very much underestimated, and things can get very complicated.
Playing dirt, you get dirty.
Yeah,
as we found out last week.
Yeah, so all linked up. So I think naivety is certainly a strong theme that comes through in that one.
I suppose there is a sense of that simplicity, or certainly our view on it, for the politics as well, and Carcetti making some big decisions in relation to all of the budgets, and there is a sense that that's all there is to it. People making these decisions and moving which way or the other way, and the massive implications that it has as a result.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, little things sparking off huge changes somewhere else in the system, definitely.
And, of course, we know very well from the show as a whole that it really likes to take small things. It really likes to kind of take the sometimes the beauty, sometimes the horror, but always the mass importance of really small things and the knock-on effect that they have. And that in itself is just a very common theme in the show as a whole. Whilst I don't find it a particularly memorable epigraph as a whole, I do think that it is quite an effective one in terms of the themes of the show. Yeah,
definitely, yeah. It brings to mind a lot of what Herc gets up to this episode, this season even, Zero. And of course he doesn't even know still a lot of the implications of what he's actually done. So, yeah, little things with big consequences.
Dare you offer up some favourite scenes? Or even favourite characters, if you really want to want to press it.
At this stage, everything is very strong. I mean, I would say that the stuff with the kids is easily the best bit in this episode. Obviously, this is probably the most focused the show ever gets on these 4 kids, and it tells a story for each of them. Michael's is obviously through some sort of emotional veil. We don't really see what's happening at his home. We get little snippets here and there. We don't really see what happens at his training. We just get little snippets here and there as the way he responds to Namond and Dukie in the episode. So, really masterfully told, and very eerie how Randy stays so absent for much of the episode to then really offer up the big dramatic finish.
Right. Well, I think that's about it for season 4, episode 12. I cannot believe that we're coming to the finale next week.
Yep, we're going to see how long this one lasts. Obviously, we've got an extra 20 minutes of show to discuss next week, so yeah.
We'll have to be economical.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks once again for joining us. Thanks again for all of the messages and emails and comments and everything that we got. It's maybe even getting to the point where we have more than we can really deal with, and we certainly couldn't read all of the emails out as much as we might want to, but we really appreciate all of the comments and messages that we get, and we'll continue to engage with all of them as much as possible. It's very much appreciated. And again, like I say, very hard to believe that we're going to be getting into the final season in only 2 weeks' time. So very much looking forward to that. But in the meantime, we'll concentrate on our season 4 finale coming next week, which is the name of the episode escapes me.
It's Final Grades.
Final Grades.
Very
that's
appropriately.
It. Yes, it is. Yeah. Yes. So thank you very much for joining us this week. and we shall see you next week for our extended finale. Until then, all the best.